Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out today for today's discussion. I'm Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center here at the Heritage Foundation. We're very pleased to be hosting today's program, co-hosting actually with Project 2049, a frequent partner of ours and a group of experts that we stay in very close touch with as we develop analysis and recommendations for U.S. policy. Today we're looking at influence operations, political warfare in East Asia and beyond. I think the turnout and the interest in this is an indication of how much hunger there is for some real analysis on the issue. I think we see signs of political warfare all around us, and it's good to sort of sit down and think through it systematically with people who are very well versed in it and have looked at it in great detail. I know from our side, Dean Cheng, who you may know, our senior research fellow here on China political security issues, has himself looked into it deeply, and he's written a few papers on the topic, and he's going to speak later, so you'll have a chance to talk to him as well. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce our principal speaker to kick off the program, Dr. Aaron Friedberg. Dr. Friedberg is Professor of Political and International Affairs at Princeton University. He's also co-director of its Center for International Security Studies. Aaron has written a few books, but the one that stands out for me is A Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for Mastery in Asia. A very highly influential book, meticulously researched, and if you haven't read it yet, I don't get any royalties for this. If you haven't read it, that you should go out and get it, because it really is, even in sort of fast-moving information age, 4 years old, it's still the thing that you need to read to understand the big picture in Asia and where U.S.-China competition fits in. Dr. Friedberg's degrees, including his PhD, are from Harvard. He's a member of the editorial boards of the Joint Forces Quarterly, Journal of Strategic Studies, and he's a member of IISS and the Council on Foreign Relations. With that, let me welcome Dr. Friedberg to the stage, or you want to go from there, whichever.
Maybe stand up.
Okay.
Get the blood flowing. Well, thank you very much, Walter. It's really a pleasure, and thanks also to Randy Shriver for inviting me. This, it seems to me, is a very important topic, but one that really has not been that much studied, with the possible exception of my co-speaker, Mark Stokes. There's not been a lot written about it, and yet I think it's extremely important in getting more so. Now, for technical reasons, the PowerPoint projector isn't working, but I hope that you have copies of the slides, because I'm going to refer to them as I go. So first, just briefly, overview the topics I'm going to talk about. Question of what is political warfare? It's worth dwelling on that for just a minute, and I'm going to borrow Mark's definition from a paper that he did in 2013 on the PLA's General Political Department, which defined political warfare as activities intended to influence the emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and behavior of foreign governments, organizations, groups, and individuals in a manner favorable to one's own objectives. And I think that's a good definition. And when framed in that way, I think it becomes clear that to the extent that the United States and China and other countries are involved in strategic competition, which I think we clearly are, actually a good portion of what's going on is in the domain of political warfare, trying to influence how the other side thinks and consequently how it behaves is a big part of what we're doing and also what China is doing and some other actors as well. In the Chinese case, this way of thinking about strategy is particularly deeply rooted. I think in some ways it's rather foreign to us or something that we're not entirely comfortable with. Certainly the notion that governments should be shaping information, whether for foreign consumption or domestic consumption, is something that runs counter to our political culture. But I think in the case of China, that is not the case. There's a deep history going back to Sun Tzu and other writers the essence of whose theories was really that the key to warfare was the control and manipulation of information. Political warfare, information warfare is deeply embedded, I think, in China's strategic culture, and it's also something that sits very comfortably in the context of the current Chinese authoritarian regime, a government that sees its own survival as being dependent on shaping the perceptions and controlling flows of information to its own people, is perfectly comfortable applying similar techniques beyond its borders. And as Mark has written, this is an activity which is richly resourced and for which multiple institutions are responsible in the Chinese context, including the PLA's General Political Department, the CCP's Central Propaganda Department, and so on. There's an elaborate infrastructure, and again, I refer you to Mark's paper for some insightful analysis of this mechanism. Again, this is an important part of the ongoing competition with the United States. So if you think about this problem writ large, the dimensions of political warfare, which is just the next slide, you can think of the United States and China as each trying to shape the perceptions and behavior of the other, and both the United States and China in various ways trying to shape the perceptions and behaviors of other parties, including others in East Asia, but not only in East Asia. So a complete appreciation and analysis of the phenomenon would require us to look at all of those various dimensions. But for purposes of my remarks, I'm just going to talk about the U.S.-China part of this, and in particular, I'm going to say some words about at least my perception of how China is trying to use information warfare or political warfare techniques to shape the perceptions and behavior of people in the United States. So what are the aims? Probably a range of objectives from minimalist to maximalist. It seems to me that China's current leaders would, if they could, like to persuade the United States that in fact it ought to accept China as an equal and maybe eventually as a dominant power in the international system. More specifically and somewhat more narrowly, I think they would like to encourage the United States to acquiesce in China's emergence or reemergence as the preponderant power in Asia in particular. And at a minimum, even if they couldn't really succeed in convincing us that that was a good thing and we ought to welcome it, at a minimum, I think the objective of their political warfare is to slow down the American response to the growth of Chinese power. So in certain respects, the object of the exercise is really to dull our competitive reflexes and to slow down our response to China's growth, China's growing power, and eventually, presumably, to create a situation in which it's no longer possible for the United States or anyone else, for that matter, to prevent China from reemerging into this position of preponderance. Of course, all of this serves the ultimate purpose of maintaining the CCP's monopoly on political power. What are the targets of Chinese political or information warfare? I think you can array them in a pyramid, as I've done on the next slide, and divide them into three slices. Probably can divide more finely in each of these, but I think for purposes of discussion, it's useful to think about three categories of targets. At the top, and traditionally, or certainly over the period going back to the 1960s and 1970s, the opening of the modern U.S.-China relationship, a great deal of focus has been placed by the Chinese on individuals highly placed in the United States system who they regard as favorably disposed in one way or another to China. People that are referred to as old friends of China, who once they become friends are kept as friends and cultivated in various ways, and who it's hoped will use their voices and their influence in the American system to participate in the debate over policy and shape that debate in ways which, from a Chinese perspective, are congenial to China. And still, I think a heavy portion of what Chinese are doing in this domain is focused at the top of the pyramid. They think in terms of elites and groups of elites, and this is where they focus a lot of energy. But over time, and I would say particularly in the last 20 years, their view has broadened. They've become more sophisticated in their understanding of the United States, among other countries, more energetic and more imaginative in their efforts to influence the discussion that goes on in the United States and elsewhere. And so the influence pyramid is broadened out to include these two other layers. There's a broadening group of people I would refer to as elites or influentials, so not just former secretaries of state, but business executives, now former military officers, former diplomats who have interacted with China in the course of their professional careers and in some cases continue to do so, and on whom the Chinese focus a good deal of attention. I'll talk in just a few minutes about some of the ways in which they do that. And I would say also increasingly efforts, although this is the part of the program which I think is least fully developed, to try to influence mass perceptions and mass understanding of what's going on in China. So the Chinese are elitists, or the Chinese rulers are elitists, but they also recognize in a country like the United States, mass opinion, public opinion, has an impact, and they're starting to look for ways to influence that as well. The focus is still on the top, but increasingly there's activity at all levels. One way of thinking about what they're doing is trying to shape the narrative, so shape the story that people tell about China and China's activities through the use of multiple pathways, targeting all of the various levels of this influence pyramid, so broadcasting to the bottom level, in some cases quite literally, in the hopes of shaping perceptions of people on the outside of the government system in the United States, but also focusing more narrowly on the people at the top and in this intermediate level. And there are a variety of different techniques that I think the Chinese are using. This is from my own observation. I haven't seen very careful study. I haven't come across efforts really to dissect this, but I think it's worth spending a little time talking about it. One of the things that you find if you're in the business of either talking to Chinese counterparts or talking to your colleagues who talk to Chinese counterparts a lot is that there appear to be efforts made to introduce certain information and arguments into the discussion that's going on in the United States to shape it in certain ways. And I give as one example comments which I heard made about Hu Jintao in the aftermath of the first North Korean nuclear test. Within a week or so of that, I had maybe a half dozen conversations with friends and colleagues in government and think tanks and so on. And many of them, those who were particularly actively involved in interaction with Chinese counterparts, reported that Hu Jintao was very angry about this North Korean nuclear test. And they had it on good authority that he was personally offended and outraged. And that trope, that story, found its way into the White House, actually, and was repeated at a meeting that various people, including the President of the United States, participated in. So it became a piece of conventional wisdom. Who's very angry about this? Well, what does that mean exactly? The implication is China can't really do anything about this. We're frustrated too. Don't lean on us to get us to solve this problem for you. This guy, Kim Jong-il, is a little bit out of control. We don't like what's happening, but really what you Americans need to do is go back to the bargaining table and be reasonable and show your sincerity and so on. So just a little piece of information, if that's what it was, that fit into a narrative about how the Chinese were reacting to the North Korean nuclear test. It may have been true, but it also was very purposeful. Another technique, which is a variation on this theme, I think, is not simply to introduce ideas or information, but, and this is a little more subtle, I think, to pick up on and echo and amplify things that they hear being said in the West, in the United States. So, for example, when former Defense Secretary Gates visited Beijing in January 2011, you may recall that there were reports that the Chinese had tested a new stealth aircraft, or if they hadn't tested it, they had allowed someone with a cell phone to film it trundling down the runway, and that when Gates raised this with Hu, the reports that came back from some of the participants in the meeting, American participants, which then found their way into the media, suggested that Hu was very surprised when this was brought up. And I don't know whether he said, I hadn't heard about this, but his body language somehow suggested that this was the case. And very quickly after that, again, through these various channels, you start picking up from Chinese interlocutors the story that Hu Jintao didn't know that this was going to happen, was very surprised by it, and of course, what are the implications here? Well, military may be a little bit off the reservation. It's not the political leadership which is doing something which is potentially offensive to American officials. It's the military doing it. Maybe, and you can draw your conclusions from this, and some people would, Maybe that means we really have to help Hu Jintao and the political leaders to keep control of the policy process and make sure that we don't do things that antagonize the military so that they do things that cause problems for us. Another example of this, which is more elaborate and which I've actually spent a little bit of time trying to dig into, but the stories about whether or not Chinese officials used the language of core national interest in the spring and summer of 2010. And just to make a long story short, my belief is that unless some very high-ranking American officials lied, which they had no reason to do, in fact, Chinese officials did use this language because they were floating a trial balloon. They wanted to see what the reaction was when they said, South China Sea is a core national interest of the United States, the implication of that being this is potentially something that's so important to us we might even go to war over it. And once those stories emerged, another narrative emerged as well, which was questioning whether, in fact, the Chinese had used this language. And so there began to be a number of stories and accounts by Western experts and others questioning whether, in fact, there had been a mistranslation or trying to determine when exactly this conversation had taken place. And the end result was muddied water, and it wasn't clear what exactly had gone on. Well, again, that could be, in fact, the case, that maybe they didn't use the language, it was a misunderstanding. The alternative, which is the view that I favor, in part because of the way the Chinese proceeded then to use similar language which they did not deny having used about the East China Sea, was that they floated this balloon. It got a pretty strong response from the United States. Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Clinton's giving a speech in which she said, freedom of navigation is a national interest or a vital national interest of the United States. And then they reeled the balloon back in and muddied the waters by sort of letting these stories go out that a lot of people then picked up and analyzed and repeated that suggested that perhaps this had never happened. Other techniques, in addition to cultivating current friends and elites, Chinese are now, I think, more actively involved, and here it's reaching down into the, down on the pyramid into identifying and cultivating new friends of China. And in one sense, and I want to underline this, and I'll say it again at the end, there's nothing illegal about this, there's nothing necessarily wrong about it, there's nothing necessarily immoral about it. However, it's purposeful and strategic to fund or to find funders for activities that bring flows of young Americans from elite universities in some cases to study in China, to spend time in China, to see China. It's all good. Who in this country could object to that? But again, I think it's purposeful. It's done for a reason, to try to create a certain impression of China and also to try to identify people who may, in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, be the new friends of China. Accompanying these more or less benign activities are some that are clearly much less so. Very active efforts that the Chinese are now making to suppress unfavorable information that might emerge from within China. So there's a very active campaign to intimidate journalists and news organizations which publish stories or cover events inside China which might find their way back into China and have presumably unfavorable consequences for the regime, but which would also contribute to an unfavorable view of China elsewhere. And this campaign has been in existence for a while, but it's ratcheted up for some time. So shaping the narrative is the sort of the instrument or the instrumentality. And then there are more particular mechanisms. And again, we look at this slide, mechanisms, just to suggest that at each level of the pyramid, the Chinese are developing tools for trying to convey these messages and trying to shape perceptions. And some of them are traditional. You have old friends. The Chinese know how to treat their old friends. You honor them, you flatter them, you reward them, you invite them to be on, come to meetings, you invite them to be, participate in dialogues, you make sure that their business ventures go well, and so on. But, and this is where I think some of the most interesting activity is going on at the second level, the Chinese have created a variety of instruments now for mechanisms for reaching and shaping and trying to influence elite discussion in the United States and elsewhere through dialogues, exchanges, joint research projects, and so on. Say more about that in just a minute. And then down at the base of the pyramid, too, I think they're becoming more active. Chinese mass media used to consist of one publication that would repeat the same slogan over and over again. Nobody read it. Nobody in their right mind would read it more than once. But now there's a whole panoply of official, quasi-official, unofficial Chinese publications, many of which, it would appear, are delivering portions of this message, and some of that is intended to get out for a wider audience. And I don't know about you, but I think I get CCTV in my cable package now. Not that I watch it that much, but I could if I wanted to. And then more widely known, of course, and now somewhat notorious, the so-called Confucius Institutes, which sprang up around this country and around the world as the Chinese were looking for a technique to convey certain images of their own society, and also, and this is what got them into trouble, trying to shape to some extent the discussion going on in foreign countries of what was happening inside China. That was a new, it was an innovation, and it still exists. So there's a growing toolkit, which includes Confucius Institutes, but also a number of quite interesting foundations, which are identified by the Chinese as private nonprofit foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation or the Ford Foundation, and also publications like the Global Times, which in addition to its Chinese format also has an English format, and which puts out stories that even if the man on the street is not reading the Global Times, what appears in the Global Times starts appearing in Western news outlets as well, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Just one case study. About 2 years ago, I started getting emails from something called the China-United States Exchange Foundation. Actually, it wasn't clearly identified as that. It was China-U.S. Focus, and it was one of these emails that included a number of articles or links to a number of articles, some of which were more interesting than others, but it looked like any one of 24 such emails that I get every week. But I noticed after a while that the composition of the pieces was a little unusual. It was some Western scholars, all of whom, after a few months, it became clear, took positions that were not uncongenial to the Chinese authorities, and then interspersed with Chinese writers from think tanks and so on, who, of course, took positions favorable to their own government. Well, dig a little further, and it turns out that this is a vehicle that's funded by something called the China-United States Exchange Foundation, which was founded in 2008, about which you can find some information if you do a little bit of digging. It's described as a privately funded, non-government, non-profit entity, but it turns out it's funded by a group of Hong Kong tycoons, some state-owned enterprises, and some very large businesses, mostly involved in real estate on the mainland, all of whom presumably have to maintain good relations with the regime in order to prosper. It's supported by the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, which has links to the government. It's advised, among others, by a senior academic from the PLA's Academy of Military Sciences, and it's chaired by a gentleman who's the vice chair of the People's Consultative Conference. So it's not exactly like the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation. In fact, it's nothing like that. It's a cutout between the authorities in China and the outside world, which, as Mark uses the term, a platform from which they can then conduct these influence operations with the outside world. It's described its mission as building, quote, understanding and trust, and among other activities, it sponsors visits to China by U.S. politicians and journalists. It is involved in funding joint research with U.S. institutes, although as nearly as I could find, most of the jointly funded projects didn't really deserve the term research. They were declarations of policy, usually involving an American counterpart and Chinese counterparts on how to promote good relations with China. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not research. And then what was described as this open platform website, which in fact, when you looked at it, didn't contain anything that was in any way critical of the Chinese government or its policies. And that's only one example. And there's some others, including China Energy Foundation, which has set up an operation here in Washington. All of this, I think, is intended to deliver two messages. First one, and now I think there's another one that's begun to emerge, and there are some problems that I'll mention in closing about trying to put forward both of these messages. The first message is really the familiar one, which is China is peaceful, defensive, and although it's not usually framed in this way, and also weak, comparatively weak. And there are many, many variations on these themes. I'm sure you're familiar with most of them. China is, always has been, and always will be peaceful. China has never invaded another country. This peaceful inclination to avoid hegemony is deeply rooted in Chinese political culture. And it's never going to change, not only because it's so deeply rooted, but because Chinese authorities recognize certain trends that are described as irresistible, so globalization. I mean, here they're kind of echoing things that liberal internationalist scholars in the West might say, and that war is totally irrational and therefore impossible. But it's not even simply that. China has also made a very careful and quite ostentatious study of the rise and fall of other great powers and will not repeat the mistakes that others have made. And then there's more specific commentary. China's military, yes, well, it's being expanded, but it's entirely defensive in nature. China's economy is still comparatively underdeveloped. China's leaders, and this is a subtle point because you don't want to go around saying that you can't manage on the world stage because you have so many problems at home. But the message, I think, that's conveyed often is that China's leaders are preoccupied with domestic troubles. And this is one, again, that you hear repeated often in the West. It may be true up to a point, but the implications of that are not at all clear. Well, I think the message that's intended here is that because they're preoccupied, they are less of a problem potentially for the United States or others, but that doesn't follow necessarily. China seeks win-win solutions. Many people in the region now joke about that. You know, China wins and then they win again. That's what a win-win solution is. And this is most interesting, I think, that to the extent that China seems to manifest worrisome external behavior, it can be explained as reactive rather than assertive. I don't know how many of you spend your time reading political science journals. I wouldn't recommend it. But if you do, you'll be aware that there's an ongoing debate that's now been running for several years and which seems to me to be totally overtaken by events, but nevertheless, about whether China's behavior is assertive or reactively assertive. Endless iterations of this when, as I said, I think the evidence, if it was in question before, has become much less suspect as time has gone on. It seems to me it's become clearer and clearer. And another interesting theme that, again, to the extent that China is doing things that that's worrisome, it's the result of uncoordinated actions, bureaucratic politics, or domestic impulses. And it's certainly not strategic. The idea that China has a strategy or a grand strategy is one that people are not encouraged to take seriously. And just as one example of this, again, when China was becoming more active in the maritime disputes, one of the things that people began to say was that this was the product of the creation of many new bureaucracies which had responsibility for maritime security. It was the PLA, but not just the PLA, and Coast Guard and different fisheries organizations which had their own little fleets of sometimes not so little boats. And really what was going on was a kind of an outward manifestation of bureaucratic politics. And this term arose and was used in the title of an international crisis group study, 9 Dragons Stirring Up the Seas. It's reference to a classical story. And then you began to hear that repeated back. It's the 9 dragons. It's the 9 different bureaucracies. It's not strategic. Well, again, I think that's become harder and harder to sustain as the evidence has accumulated that China is indeed behaving in a very purposeful way. So all of this is one message. China is not a problem and won't be and is relatively weak. The second message, which is a newer one, is to the contrary, that China is strong, that it's determined, and although this isn't said explicitly either, that it's effectively unstoppable and irresistible. And trying to stop it or resist it won't work and will be very dangerous for any who attempt it. I haven't gone back and looked at this, but I think it would be useful to look, for example, at the extent to which the Chinese have publicized certain kinds of tests of military capabilities. But the ASAT test, that may not have been entirely intended to produce the effects that it did, although they had to know that smashing two things together at whatever it was, 23,000 miles an hour, would produce a lot of debris. The J-20 test that I referred to, the much publicized hypersonic vehicle tests, and the DF-21, which if you watched the parade a couple weeks ago, you will see in the picture on the slide is of that parade. It was helpfully painted with the designator DF-21, in case anyone missed it. And of course, this is the supposed ship-killing ballistic missile. The Chinese have gone from hiding capabilities to advertising them, flaunting them, and I think in some important respects probably exaggerating their capabilities. And that's a significant shift and one that's worth studying more closely. They've also begun to conduct very large-scale and quite visible military exercises, including bigger and bigger naval exercises at further and further range. And of course, they know that the United States and others are watching this. They've started, too, to use quasi-official media to send what I think are intended to be sort of deniable, tough messages. And for example, a year or so ago, maybe it was a bit more than that, the Global Times on its Chinese website ran a story about the effect of Chinese new submarine-launched ballistic missiles if they were used against the United States, which included maps showing the fallout on the West Coast and how far the plumes would go inland if these weapons were ever used. Well, that's pretty threatening. That's not something you would expect to see in the People's Daily. It appeared on the Global Times. It was picked up, translated, and then taken down. Well, again, I think this is not accidental. It's a way of sending a message about China's growing capabilities. In the language that Chinese officials used in public and also in private, they are increasingly focused on emphasizing resolve. The language of core national interest, which I referred to earlier, is intended as a way of signaling resolve, and it's something relatively new. Something that is a core national interest is something you would be willing to fight for. In private discussions, at least, Chinese military officers and officials now say to their American counterparts things that they've said in the past about Taiwan, but now are starting to say about some of the offshore disputes. Public opinion in China may force us to fight. We're being compelled. We would face disastrous consequences at home if we gave way. Well, again, maybe it's true. Maybe the people saying it believe it, but it's also purposeful. And in various ways, the Chinese are, although they're nervous about being pushed forward and having people say their GDP has exceeded the GDP of the United States and so on, they're also encouraging the notion that they're unstoppable and that a level of equality or parity with the United States, something which a few years ago Chinese officials would have forsworn, is in fact now here. The whole idea of the new type great power relationship is that it's new because the United States and China are going to deal with one another as equals. So that's a second message. Just to wrap up a few comments. I think the Chinese face some challenges and there are some obvious contradictions in what they're doing. First and foremost, these messages are contradictory. It's hard to reconcile the tough with the soft. There are ways of doing it, but it's not so easy. And of course, it's impossible now to separate those messages. Everything is instantly available everywhere. So if you're communicating to one audience, even if it's a domestic audience, people outside are going to know. There's also, I think, a problem of the growing tension between words and deeds. Chinese officials, of course, as leaders of most countries, say they only have peaceful designs and so on. But the incongruity between some of the rhetoric and some of the behavior makes the softer message not just seem disingenuous, but even deceptive. So there begins to be a problem with the soft message when the behavior doesn't align with it. If you look at the influence pyramid, the old friends of China, the original old friends of China, are getting very old, although they're still at it. And it's not clear that they've been replaced with people who are of equal status. I think there's a sort of, I won't say revolution, but there is a process that's been underway for the last decade or so in which the discussion of China and China's intentions and China's behavior has become much broader in the United States. It's not just the the purview of a few experts on China who generally have held certain kinds of views, but it's become much wider. More people are involved in it. And I think, to some extent, the people who were the traditional keepers of the wisdom about China have been on the defensive since China's behavior has become more assertive, because that wasn't what was supposed to happen. China was supposed to become more fully integrated into the international system. It was supposed to become a responsible stakeholder. It was on the way to becoming a status quo power, and that seems clearly not to be true. So some of the people who were saying those things are now not as, their views are not taken as given. The consensus in the business community in the United States is also fraying. So at one time, it was possible for China to rely on a very solid group of very influential businesses and individuals representing high tech and services and so on. Those people may come when Xi Jinping calls to a meeting in Seattle, but I guarantee you they're cursing him when they walk out of the room because of the demands that he and the Chinese government are imposing on them, transferring technology and so on. And there's also begun to be some backlash against some of these Chinese activities. The American Association of University Professors, I'm proud to say, sent out a letter in which it advised universities to re-examine their existing relationships with the Confucius Institutes, because many of them involved secret covenants, kinds of deals that no self-respecting American university would make with the United States government, let alone an entity that's connected to the Chinese government. I've never been prouder to be a university professor. I even thought of taking out a membership in the AAUP, but then I thought better of it. So there are challenges and there are contradictions. Finally, just a couple of words. As Lenin said, what is to be done? How do you harden yourself? How do we harden ourselves as a country against Chinese political warfare? That is not easy, in part because, as I indicated, most of what the Chinese are doing is not illegal. It, in fact, in certain respects, may appear to be in keeping with our culture of open discussion and open debate. And for that reason, I think, a large part of the response to it is not going to come from government, but is going to have to come from the private sector. If the U.S. government got itself involved in some of these activities or banned them or tried to regulate them, there would be an outcry, and for good reason. As far as the private sector is concerned, it seems to me transparency is the best defense. So some of these foundations that I mentioned earlier have links to the CCP, have links to the PLA. The people dealing with them may not be aware of that. There ought to be a way in which they can find out. Somebody ought to be keeping a sort of a database. It's not that hard to turn up some of this information so that at least the boards of foundations or the trustees of universities or individuals can do due diligence and find out where the money is coming from before they accept it. Universities, think tanks, scholars should be open about funding sources. Many journals in my field require you to specify if you publish an article that funding has come from U.S. government agencies. As far as I'm aware, there's no similar requirement for these quasi-private entities that are connected with other governments, including the Chinese. Some NGOs are very active now, as they should be, and news organizations in publicizing attempts by the Chinese to coerce or control flows of information. So the private sector has a big part, but so too does the U.S. government. And some others have suggested, and I think it's worth considering, that when the Chinese do things like denying visas to U.S. journalists, the State Department should do the same for Chinese journalists. If the Chinese government is involved in harassing or limiting the activities of Western information gathering and media companies in China, the proposed investments that some of those firms would like to make in media and entertainment in the United States ought to be subject to careful examination. And last but not least, I think to an extent that we have not done so, it would be a good thing for us to develop a kind of counter narrative which would be directed at countering and to some extent neutralizing both the soft and the hard message. So the soft message is, as I've described, and the response to that is, well, these claims of peaceful intent are to some extent disingenuous. I think we ought to do more than we do in a more systematic way to publicize, without exaggerating, Chinese military developments, the translation of a wider variety of Chinese writings on things like political warfare would at least give more people a window into understanding how some people on the other side are thinking. We've, for years, published reports on human rights violations. Seems to me we ought to consider publishing an annual report on cyber attacks instead of kind of whining about it and then not doing anything about it. Some private entities in the United States, CSIS, have set up websites that carry images and information about China's maritime activities. That seems to me to be desirable, and there's an element of that which has not really been discussed very much, which is the enormous environmental damage that the Chinese have been doing with all of this dredging. So those are things to which attention could usefully be called. And then countering the tough message. China's preponderance is not inevitable, and it's not right around the corner. Without downplaying or underestimating what they're doing, it's not that difficult to point out some of the shortcomings and difficulties with the new military capabilities they're trying to acquire. China faces enormous challenges as regards its demographics, the problem of corruption, environmental degradation. There are ways of talking about that. When the State Department started putting up online the figures about the level of air pollution in Chinese cities, that may have been the most effective act of political warfare that the United States has ever engaged in against China. It's utterly harmless, but it serves the purpose of reminding people the extent of the problems that have to be dealt with. And last but not least, instead of sort of talking ourselves down and talking the Chinese up, we ought to be highlighting and contrasting some of the enduring strengths that I believe this country has in relation to China. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I suppose your presentation in and of itself is partly a counter to the whole political warfare concept, and hopefully we can get into a little bit of Q&A so we can talk about the sources and the background for some of this, because it's much more than just speculation or theorizing or putting together one and two to get three. There's real sources and background to all of these things that you're talking about. You know, I hope in the intro I gave enough credit to Project 2049 as co-hosts for this, because in fact, it's the next speaker's brainchild. Mark Stokes, if you don't know him, he's executive director of Project 2049. He is Air Force officer, retired 20 years, and he was the DoD desk officer for China, Mongolia, and the PRC, where I think myself and I know many of the rest of us got to know him a little bit. So let me welcome Mark to the stage and take us the next step on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. If it's okay, can I just be lazy and maybe have a seat to speak sitting? First, I'd like to express my appreciation for the warm introduction and the honor to come over to Heritage Foundation and talk about one of my favorite subjects. It's as Professor Freeberg outlined, it's a complex subject, but in my view, it's important not just because of some of the challenges it could pose the U.S. Statecraft, but also just in terms of sort of thinking through how China itself does statecraft, how its foreign policy is formulated and executed. The bottom line in terms of the research that I've done, to me, says that they approach foreign policy in a different way than we do in terms of the process and the thinking and the sort of the organizational structure. It may be a good thing that we actually don't have slides, 'cause I actually had a prepared briefing of about 14, 15, 16 slides. And if we had that slide presentation, I could ramble on for hours, 2 or 3 hours at least. So what should have been... yes. So what should have been handed out is sort of a selection, maybe 3 or 4 slides that are from a larger presentation. But to start off with, and Professor Freeberg outlined some of these things, but trying to get a grasp, why do we call it political warfare? And there certainly are other terms. I like the term political warfare because it describes, because where my focus is, which is on the People's Liberation Army General Political Department. And it's political, and it's also warfare in the sense of it's an aspect of their military force. From time to time, I'm asked to sort of to outline relative strengths and weaknesses between the United States defense establishment and the People's Liberation Army. And it's a difficult and it's a complex question to address. But perhaps the easiest way to address it is simply to outline 2 areas, 2 two areas in which the PRC is well-resourced and organized and his ability to mobilize resources, and that we don't have. And there are two. One is land-based conventional ballistic and land attack cruise missiles with ranges between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers that we don't have because we're restricted under the INF treaty, both us and Russia. But the other one is political warfare. This is the General Political Department, Liaison Department that I'll discuss in some detail given time limitations. But one could use other terms for this. There's strategic communications, that's been used from time to time. There is propaganda. Bear in mind that the propaganda tends to be sort of the channels, the channels in which information is transmitted. One could use an old term, subversion. Subversion, of course, is defined under Joint Pub 1.02 from a 2003 publication as actions designed to undermine the political, economic, or the military, economic, psychological, or political strength or morale of a governing authority. We could use the term influence operations, as the title of this conference outlines. Perception management is used slightly less these days, but still is outlined in a number of U.S. joint publications dating back to 2003 timeframe. At the operational or tactical level, the term of art these days would be military information support operations, or MISO for short. And so there's a variety of terms to describe what we're talking about. The background in terms of, and let me also say the Chinese term that they use, which is military liaison work. PLA, military liaison work, is somewhat of an amorphous term, to tell us a lot. But the PLA has a lot of experience in political warfare. And it's not just Chinese culture, even, for example, Sun Tzu and these sort of things. I would argue that the most significant influence on Chinese political warfare today is rooted in the Leninist tradition, Leninist organization tradition, going way back. Bear in mind that the Chinese Communist Party was a member of the Comintern for about the first 20 years of their existence, with a lot of their a selected number of their political cadre that were educated in Moscow. But there was significant liaison between some of the early sort of coordination between some of the early, what you would call agitation and propaganda organizations between the former USSR and the Chinese Communist Party during the early days. The earlier traditions, there were three aspects of what's called underground work. There was urban work, which was focused primarily on, for example, students, minorities, and urban residents. And this eventually morphed today through various iterations into the United Front Work Department. There's a social work department that eventually morphed into what is today, in very, very rough form, the Ministry of State Security. And then starting in about 1937, there was the General Political Department, Enemy Work Department. The initial focus of the Enemy Work Department during the War with Japan and also the Civil War was focused primarily on to some extent on Japanese leaders and prisoners of war, but primarily focused on what they called puppet forces, which were some of the Chinese commanders in areas that were occupied by Japanese. But their goal also, of course, was to bring over those of the central government. This was the KMT government at the time. There was, and sort of the catchphrase that was used at the time was unite with friends, disintegrate enemies, and pull those in the middle over. This term is still used until today. The best outline, bear in mind, there's not a lot of information out there on the General Political Department, Liaison Department. One could actually find more information on the General Staff Department, Technical Reconnaissance Department, than one can find on the Liaison Department. But it is certainly a very significant, very significant organization. It's divided up in basically to four sort of mission areas that include investigation and research. Basically, it means what you would call traditional espionage. Bear in mind that some of the traditions that go into political warfare come from one of the best sources. Actually, is some of Goebbels' diaries from old World War II, the old World War II era, and of course some of the information that's put out on Soviet active measures. And there are reports to Congress that were issued on this that can give you a general idea on at least on the common themes and common efforts. Bearing in mind that the Soviet Union and how they approach this is quite different from the way the Chinese Communist Party approaches it. In your slide package, you also see a slide, a sort of a very complex organization slide. And it's complex because it is a complex issue in terms of the way that they're structured. You do have the political bureau, and you have other organizations that are responsible for certain aspects of political warfare. Like, for example, Professor Friedberg outlined the Central Propaganda Department, or the Central Publicity Department, depending on what term you want to use. I would argue that the Central United Front Work Department plays a very important role. You have, for domestic security, of course, you have what I call the state security leading small group. I use the term state security, not national security, because to me it's really about state security, not national security in the way that we think about it. Then you have the Central Military Commission, which is very important. And within the Central Military Commission, you have the General Political Department, in which you have, let's say, about eight second-level departments, of which liaison department is one. And the liaison department, very difficult to break out in terms of bureaus, but they have 4 bureaus, one of which is dedicated toward Taiwan operations. They also have 2 sort of regional-based bureaus, one in Shanghai and one in Guangzhou. Taiwan figures prominently in this effort. I'd argue Taiwan is the number 1 priority. Japan, closely followed by Japan, and this sort of bears out in history about who's directed the GPD liaison department. It's either been sort of a Taiwan expert or a Japan expert, and I would say the United States follows number 3. Just give you a sense about what in terms of where it comes into play, and it's very difficult to say with certainty if an operation can be attributed to the General Political Department, liaison department. But you can certainly look at effects and try to trace it back from there. But to just give you an example, this conference takes place on the footsteps of the celebrations commemorating the World War II anniversary. When I look at the celebrations and look at the conferences that have taken place, in my view, the first thing that comes to mind, besides the military equipment, which I mentioned also, but the first thing that comes to mind is it's obvious what to me what the political warfare goal is, and that's to try to change an objective reality. The objective reality, in my view, is that Taiwan, under its current Republic of China constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state today. I mean, that's objective reality. It is. This is independent of recognition as such. Bear in mind that recognition does not, I mean, it's relative, it's related to, but not necessarily completely relevant to this objective reality. So you look at the parade, and you see very little mention of the ROC, very little mention of the ROC. When actually, with the World War, the bulk of the effort in the conflict against Japan was actually led by the ROC, the Central Government Forces, with the CCP playing a role, but playing a relatively small role compared to the ROC. And what this seems to me is fairly clear, with very little mention of the ROC, is that what the goal here was to be able to sort of consolidate what one could call the successor state theory. Successor state theory is that the ROC ceased to exist in 1949, and the CCP inherited, and the PRC inherited all traditions and all the successes and failures, well, no failures, but successes since then. So to me, this is, in terms of trying to conditioning or sort of promoting a constructed narrative, this to me is a significant example of the role that the General Political Department plays in sort of manipulating perceptions out there. And there's a lot more to cover, and I can share. We published a report on this in 2013 that can go into excruciating detail, and there's a lot more work that, in my view, that still needs to be done. A lot of questions that need to be answered, and it's an important subject and one that I find fascinating. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our host and address questions.
That's a great start. I'm trying to think how to stay relatively on time. So we got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. Maybe what we could do is have the next panel come up, and then you guys take questions along with everyone else if they come up from the audience. How does that work? Okay, because we might have a little bit of wiggle room that we could work with. So with that, let me invite Sabrina and all up to start the next session.
Thank you very much to Dr. Friedberg and Mark Stokes, as well as Walter, for starting us off and for an informative briefing. I just want to invite you guys to grab a copy of the General Political Department report that Mark is referring to. It's outside in the lobby, so on your way out, you can grab one of those. So we're going to transition seamlessly into our panel section today. I will keep the introduction short, as you already have a great introduction from our first session. So to my immediate left, we have Mr. Dean Chen. He's a senior research fellow here at the Asian Studies Center. He is an expert on Chinese military, as well as foreign policy affairs, and he's written a lot on China's space issues, as well as technology and science infrastructure. His backgrounder report on Chinese political warfare is very helpful. As I have been researching and studying this issue, I've referred to those, as well as my boss, Mark Stokes' reports as well, to help kind of with understanding this really obscure and unconventional topic. To his left, we have Mr. Liu Shizhong. He is the Deputy Secretary General of the Tainan City Government in Taiwan. He previously was the president and CEO of Taiwan Brain Trust, a Taipei-based think tank. And prior to that, he served as the director of the International Affairs Department for Taiwan's main opposition party, the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP. And he also served under former President Chen Shui-bian as a senior policy advisor from 2000 to 2006. And next to him, we have Mr. Randall Shiver. Randy is the president and CEO of the Project 2049 Institute. He is also a founding partner of Armitage International. Prior to that role, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs from 2003 to 2005. And prior to that, he was the Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor to former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. And with that said, I'll turn it over to Dean. If we can keep it maybe 10, 12 minutes each. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. So my comments today are going to build upon the remarks of Dr. Freeberg and Mark Stokes. Let me begin by noting a little bit about political warfare, the meaning and context. Political warfare, as we've already heard, is a means of influencing perceptions. It works at a variety of levels. But for the Chinese in particular, what the objective here is to shape how things are perceived. It is aimed at shaping how events are interpreted. If a conflict arises, is it a just war? Who is at fault? Who is considered the aggressor? The pyramid that Dr. Friedberg laid out is interesting in terms of who you target in the United States. But I would suggest that there is a different pyramid, if you will, of who it is, more broadly speaking, that Chinese political warfare is targeting in general. And it begins, most importantly, with China's own population. At the end of the day, if you cannot secure domestic political support, if you cannot allay domestic concerns, you're going to be in trouble. Your next target is your adversary's population and leadership. And those are two separate but obviously related entities. Particularly in a democracy, if you can erode popular support, popular will for a conflict, even if the leadership remains committed, it's very hard to sustain a war. And Vietnam is an obvious example of that. And finally, third-party populations and leadership, because you basically want to, at a minimum, ensure that neutral states remain neutral. That would be desirable. But if you could, bring them in on your side would be even better. Political warfare has assumed growing importance in the context of what the Chinese term informationized warfare. What is informationized warfare? It is the application of information technology to all aspects of conflict. It is precision-guided munitions, all those really cool pictures of tomahawks going through the second window on the left, but not the third window, because that was a bathroom. But it is also the application of information technology to such aspects as personnel records, logistics, training. And because warfare ultimately is both a reflection of the economic and technological elements of the day, informationized warfare is to the information era, which is where we are now, as mechanized warfare was to the industrial era. That is, from the Chinese perception, the nature of conflicts has changed. And if during the industrial era, wars were going to be won or lost by sheer amounts of output, obviously tactical competence and the rest still applied, then in the information era, the key is to being able to establish information dominance. Political warfare, then, is the effort to establish information dominance at the strategic level, to be able to influence how everyone looks at the data at that highest strategic level. And by shaping, influencing, undermining adversary views, attracting third parties, you can, one, win without fighting, or at least through minimal fighting, and you may be able to deter, and here it's very important to note that the Chinese term for deterrence, 威慑, embodies both dissuasion and coercion. You will be able to deter or coerce an adversary by hollowing out their will. Now, as has already been noted, political warfare is largely conducted by the General Political Department, one of the 4 general departments of the People's Liberation Army. The important thing I would stress here is that when something is being conducted by one of the 4 general departments, when it is in fact a specified responsibility, as noted in the 2003 and 2010 work regulations, political work regulations of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, what this means is that this has very high-level bureaucratic support. This is not other duties as assigned. This is not some minor sort of thing, if you have time, look into this, Lieutenant. This is something that has an entire bureaucratic structure organized around it to implement it, and the General Political Department is arguably as important, and in some ways is more secure than the General Staff Department, which means that when senior commanders are making these plans, are formulating them, and they need resources, or they need coordination in the implementation. This is not a, get away from me, kid, you're bugging me. This is a very senior level bureaucratic entity able to say, I want this to happen, make it so. Now, notably, the political work regulations of the Chinese People's Liberation Army also laid out the 3 warfares. And let me just briefly discuss each of these 3. First, public opinion warfare, also sometimes translated as media warfare. Interestingly, Chinese writings on this note that this is perhaps in some ways the most important of the 3 warfares. It can stand alone. And if you think of political warfare as the strategic level of information warfare, that makes sense. Because at the end of the day, how we look at the world, how leaders look at the world, is in part a function of this public opinion, in the sense of what does it mean? How do I look at this? What do the people think? What does my electorate think? What do my donors think? It is a constant, ongoing effort, and it is global. That's why Xinhua has established a 24-hour English language news service. This is why CCTV has branches everywhere, including very nice digs over on New York Avenue. Xinhua today has perhaps the most extensive reporting network in Africa. I believe every capital has a Xinhua bureau there. And the implication of that is, when you look in Western newspapers, when you look in Western news clipping services, including the old Early Bird, back when DoD still produced that, by the end there, they were clipping Xinhua products about Africa, which means that our perceptions of what is going on in Africa at some level is being filtered through the lens of the Chinese state-run media. Now, if you're the Chinese, you look at this and it's like, yeah, so you've been doing this even longer. Because one of the important things to keep in mind is from the Chinese perspective, the West, especially but not only the United States, has been undertaking public opinion warfare since at least 1949. Deng Xiaoping, who arguably has been the most pro-Western leader, or at least most open to the West, openly talked about fearing Westernization and peaceful evolution. Why is peaceful evolution bad? Because peaceful evolution meant evolving away from the rule of the CCP. And Hu Jintao and other Chinese leaders have regularly invoked concerns about cultural security, whether or not China's culture was under attack by the malign forces of Disney, Coca-Cola, and Ronald McDonald. This is an important concern if you are the Chinese. And again, this has long, deep roots back to the late 19th century, when Western influence was seen as at least as malign as it was benign. Second is legal warfare. Arguably, this is perhaps the most publicly recognized of the three warfares. There's been a fair amount of discussion in various places on legal warfare. And let me emphasize here that legal warfare really isn't necessarily a Chinese invention. Those who have read Saul Alinsky, an interesting name I suspect to invoke here at the Heritage Foundation, will note that many of his tactics were in fact a form of legal warfare. Compel your adversary to live by their own rules and highlight their hypocrisy and failures to do so. General Charles Dunlap, formerly of the U.S. Air Force, now director of Legal Studies Department Center, down at Duke University Law School, has written about how Palestinians and Latin American guerrilla forces have both employed legal warfare. The idea ultimately behind legal warfare is what I do is legal, what you do is illegal, and if I have to break the law, it's because you have put me into that position. It is in part, I would suggest, grounded in the Chinese case by a fundamentally different legal tradition. We, the West, believe in rule of law. China, but also arguably Asia writ large, has long believed in rule by law. And so you create the law in order to support previously determined ends. The 2005 anti-secession law in China was passed to create the conditions whereby, well, if Taiwan declares independence, we will have no choice. Our law will require us to prevent secession. This is the law. You can't ask us to be lawbreakers now, would you? At the same time, it is interesting to note that it is in and of itself also a tool. I would suggest that the Chinese use of law enforcement vessels in the South China Sea and the East China Sea is in part an implicit political message stating, why are we using the Coast Guard? Why are we using police forces? Because this is Chinese territory. You enforce domestic law with domestic forces. I don't have to use the military to enforce the law in my territory any more than I need F-16s flying down parts of well, actually, Chicago would be a bad example. You might want to do that. No more than you would necessarily want to use the U.S. military to patrol your average streets. The third of the three warfares is psychological warfare. And ultimately, I would suggest this is actually the most important of the three warfares, because it really focuses on the ultimate target. And the ultimate target is influencing the perceptions, the fears, the concerns of the three audiences I noted earlier: the domestic, the adversary, and the neutral third party. In all of these cases, it is to create a set of perceptions. China is, in some ways, Schrodinger's cat. Whether the cat is alive or dead depends on when you open the box. Is China a weak power, or is China a strong power? Is China on the verge of internal disorder, or is it on the verge of marching on everyone? Well, you kind of have to open the box to find out. You really might not like what you find. So make that concession. It's not that big a concession. Psychological warfare. And of course, in all of this, the omnipresent reminder that China is a nuclear armed power, a useful psychological tool, as well as a de facto nuclear deterrent, which is it really worth taking on a nuclear power? It is very important to recognize in all of this discussion that political warfare is ultimately warfare. And the Chinese writings on political warfare and the three warfares emphasize this point. Now, warfare is not simply the use of tanks and planes and ships. It is undertaken in coordination with other means, including non-military means, in order to achieve a political set of objectives. And so that's the first thing to keep in mind about political warfare. There is an objective in mind, not just to influence the other side. That is ultimately a means to a larger end. And that larger end is determined by the political leadership. And it is undertaken according to a single unified plan in coordination with other elements of national power, other elements of military power. So it is not done willy-nilly. You have to think of this in some ways like a concert orchestra. And the oboes and the woodwinds and the drums and the brass are each playing something slightly different, but it is all to one larger sheet of music. And if you think of what's going on in the South China Sea, we see a lot of this. We have public opinion warfare. which is aimed at all of the audiences to say the same thing. This is China's. Whether you're an admiral at the RUSI conference recently, or you are meeting with the Americans in various mill exchanges, or you have people-to-people exchanges, the message is always the same. The South China Sea is China's. You have legal articles, the reinterpretation of UNCLOS, the reinterpretation of legal arguments about what constitutes an island. You have psychological warfare in the form of intimidation, such as with the USS Cowpens, or the barrel roll over a US P-8 about a year ago. With the implicit question, are these uninhabited islands really worth the possibility of a conflict with a nuclear power? But because it is ultimately one of many instruments, you see it backed by physical changes, the construction of islands. You see it supported by military presence. You see it undertaken in conjunction with economic pressure, such as against the Philippines. And you see, as I said earlier, the use of law enforcement vessels to send an implicit message that this is Chinese domestic territory. All of which is to say that political warfare is a very large, very complex set of issues. There is fairly extensive Chinese writings on the subject, very little of which has been translated. But it is something that we confront on a day-to-day basis. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean. Shichong?
Well, thank you, Sabrina. Let me start by thanking Project 2049 for inviting me back to this conference. I'm going to go through stage by stage a very concrete practice of how the Chinese has been using these political warfares in Taiwan in the past 2 decades. So let me start with the first stage. First stage starts with the mid-90s. I'm sure you're aware of what happened in 96. China launched a missile test along with Taiwan's first ever direct election of the president. And then in 2000 elections, the then Chinese Prime Minister Zhu Rongji also came up with some verbal intimidations on the eve of the election. And this stage starts from mid-90s all the way to 2004. It coincides with the DPP's President Chen Shui-bian's first term. So after the first international political party in Taiwan, the Chinese continue to resort to this unilateral approach of political warfare in the then DPP administration by continuing to isolate in Taiwan's international space and also by engaging in diplomatic warfares with Taiwan's diplomatic allies. And the result was counterproductive. In 2000, then Chen Shui-bian was elected. And then in the following years, there has been more and more Taiwanese identity, stronger Taiwan identifications going on, and more anti-China sentiment. The second stage is from 2005 to 2008. Again, it coincides with Chen Shui-bian's second terms. In this stage, I think Chinese is getting smarter and smarter. They don't want to do this alone unilaterally. They want to introduce this divide and conquer and also united front strategy against the second Chen Shui-bian administrations. So they try to team up with the then opposition Kuomintang and also the third largest party, the People First Party. They invited the leaders of those 2 opposition parties to Beijing in 2005. And then, as Dean pointed out, in 2005, to provide a legal basis for anti-Taiwan independence, they come up with this anti-secession law in spring 2005. I think in this period, Beijing's united front strategy and divided conquer strategy worked quite well. Not only it has isolated the second Chen Shui-bian administration, but it also, portrayed the image that there are certain parts of political forces in Taiwan that have been worked closely with the Chinese. The third stage starts at 2008 to, I would say, fall 2014. That was pretty much the first 6-7 years of the current Ma Ying-jeou administration of the Kuomintang. And Beijing continue not only this divided conquer strategy, but also to try very hard to reach out to the rank and file of Taiwan society, and even to the local government, even to the DPP, DPP's opposition to DPP's stronghold in the southern part of Taiwan. And their target audience focus on three aspects. One, is in Chinese, what we call Sanzhong. It's people who live in the mid and central and southern part of Taiwan, or small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as the medium and lower classes. And they are doing this in a series of measures, just name it. First one, through some Taiwanese businessmen, Taiwanese business tycoon who have had a huge investment in Chinese market. Those Taiwanese businessmen purchase Taiwan medias. For example, the Wang Daily Corporation now owns 2 or 3 TV stations, 2 newspapers, 1 magazine. They would have purchased more stations if it wasn't because of a stronger backlash from Taiwan societies. The second measure, they also support some KMT local politicians. A lot of local politicians, KMT mostly, have their investment in China. Of course, Beijing did this through indirect channels of Taiwanese businessmen to provide them political contributions so that they can deepen Chinese influence in Taiwan's local areas. The third one is, of course, to send a lot of delegation, provincial delegation, to sort of adopt each one of Taiwan's cities and counties and to purchase agricultural and fish products, so hope that they can win the hearts and minds of Taiwanese people. And the fourth one, in the past few years, we have seen more and more new political parties, small political parties coming up in Taiwan societies. I'll just name one. This party, the key members of this party are the Chinese spouse. Right now, according to them, their member has reached to 40,000 last years, and they, of course, very much pro KMTs. So those are the pretty much the way that Beijing has adopted. But of course, during President Ma Ying-jeou's first term, cross-strait relations went pretty smooth. And I think this policy worked relatively good in the first Ma Ying-jeou administrations. However, things changed a lot when Ma Ying-jeou entered into his second term in 2012. On the one hand, Beijing wanted more. On the other hand, of course, Ma Ying-jeou administration wanted to fast-track cross-strait trade and economic relationships. So in fall 2013 and then all the way to spring 2014, the Ma administration tried to fast-track the passage of so-called service and trade agreement on both sides. And but of course, there has been growing backfire from Taiwan societies and all the way to this famous civil movement called the Sunflower Movement in the spring of 14th. And the Taiwan's parliament was occupied. And this event was not single-handedly orchestrated by the opposition DPP because those civil movement leaders, they don't see any kind of transparencies between the Ma Ying-jeou administration with its Chinese counterparts when it comes to this kind of agreements. It's people-to-people exchanges agreement, not just goods. So they backfire, and then the Ma Ying-jeou administration failed to address the public needs. So there was this Sunflower Movement. And then after the movement, leaders on both KMT and DPP agreed that more transparency are needed in future cross-strait negotiations. So the current Taiwan Parliament is pending on enacting a new law governing future cross-strait negotiations. The fourth stage is starting from November last year all the way and went beyond. November, I think the current governing Kuomintang suffered a huge electoral setback in the local elections. And of course, the opposition DPP won a landslide victories. Right now, the DPP governs 13 out of 22 cities and counties in Taiwan, and over 60% of the population are under DPP's control. So that deepens the Chinese fears of why would, in the past few years, the Chinese has been yielding a lot of interest to Taiwan. How come there are more and more anti-China sentiments in this regards? And then they finally find out reason, because KMT is too weak, KMT is too, they all went behind the majority of Taiwanese public opinions, and then force the Beijing leaders to adopt a change of strategy. now they return to what I call the unilateralism to deal with future cross relations, especially under Xi Jinping's leadership. Let me just name you a couple of measures that has been adopted by Beijing government in these years. Of course, because they don't trust KMT anymore. KMT is too weak, it's in disarray. So Beijing find out that it's unaccountable to rely on KMT as a broker to reach out to the Taiwan societies. So for example, excuse me, in January, Beijing unilaterally announced this M503 flight route along the middle line of Taiwan Strait. In July, Beijing announced that they are going to issue this ID card, sorry. Right now, all Taiwanese people who have been traveling back and forth across straits, they have this paper ID card. And starting in July, Beijing made an announcement in July that they're going to issue the ID card for the purpose of convenience. And then in September, Beijing unilaterally implemented this policy without prior consultation and notification with the its Taiwanese counterpart. So Taiwan government was kind of caught in surprise, caught off guard of this. But of course, Beijing and Taiwan government kept saying that this ID card is no different than the previous paper card. There would be no violation of privacy or national security. But I think the political elements of this policy shows that Beijing wanted to downgrade Taiwanese comrades' status to the people in Hong Kong and Macau. And they want to do this by their own way. So they don't want to even consult with the KMT government. And not to mention, in July, Beijing enacted a national security law. And in the Article 11, Section 2 stated clearly that to maintain national sovereignty, unification, and territorial integrity constitutes the common obligation of people living in Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Again, as a legal basis for pushing forward unification and the national sovereignty. Fourth measures, very soon, Beijing side will suspend this Coast Guard united rescue exercise between Xiamen and Jinmen, those two offshore islands. And very soon, 1 month before Taiwan's January elections, Beijing will suspend 95% of tourists to come to Taiwan. Now, for the purpose of saving more 5 seats of those Taiwanese businessmen and family who live in Taiwan, in mainland, so that they can come back to Taiwan and vote. But again, it shows that Beijing has already tried to influence the upcoming presidential and legislative election in Taiwan. So, what are the general public Taiwanese people's reaction to those newly unilateral approach conducted by Beijing? I think this also has something to do with how Xi Jinping addressed the Taiwan issues 2 weeks ago when he was in Washington, D.C., and especially after he met with President Obama. It strikes me a little bit that Xi Jinping did not say anything about Taiwan in his joint press conference with President Obama. But I think that he did mention Taiwan in the closed-door sessions with President Obama. I think it shows that Xi is quite confident in dealing with the post-election cross-strait relations in Taiwan, and they possess a few of a political tool to further deepen this political warfare. For example, they could easily suspend a number of Chinese tourists to Taiwan. They could shut down or suspend the official channel of dialogues on both sides. They could further isolate Taiwan's international space. They could also relaunch this diplomatic warfare with Taiwan. But I would say that according to the transformation of Taiwan public opinions on cross relations, if Xi Jinping and the Beijing government try to do this kind of punishment to the next DPP government, it will be it will backfire. It will be backfire, no doubt about it. Because if you look at most public surveys that has been released in the past few years, it shows a lot of evidence. Number one, there's been stronger and stronger Taiwan identity. And those people identify Taiwan as their country, not China. Number two, there has been more and more pro-independence status quo now in Taiwan society. Fewer and fewer people are for unification or immediate unifications. So I think the general Taiwanese people's perception of cross-strait relations is very clear. And not to mention that there has been growing anti-China sentiment within Taiwan societies. The latest poll shows that there over 60% perceive China as unfriendly to Taiwan. So it shows that there has been some sort of uncertainty associated with future cross-strait relation if Xi Jinping and Beijing leaders perceive that their political warfare on Taiwan still works, and they will continue to do so. So since now I'm working at the local government, I can show you one story. I can tell you one story to wrap up my presentation. For those of you who know Taiwan politics, Tainan City that I'm representing is a dark green area. Over 80% of the Tainan voters supported the DPP, now the opposition. And there are 2 million people in Tainan City right now. There's a district called Xuejia District in Tainan City that produced milkfish, the most milkfish in Taiwan. And milkfish is very nutritious and it's a high value added. And in the past 5-6 years, the Chinese have sent delegation to Tainan, to Xuejia County, to purchase the milkfish as a way to hopefully buy out the DPP's supporters. But in last November's local elections, the current incumbent mayor of Tainan City, Lai Qingde, he won over 80% of votes in Xuejia district. Of course, not to mention that he won almost 73% of votes in the bigger Tainan cities. So after the election, he approaches some of the fishermen in Xuejia district and asked them, kind of joke them that since you have been doing a lot of business with the Chinese, how come you still vote for me? And their response was quite, I would say, inspiring. They said that, Mayor Lai, we trade fish with the Chinese, but we don't trade votes and salt. So let me stop here and welcome your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Andy?
Thank you very much. I think I'll help us catch up a little bit here and be very brief, and I can be brief for a couple reasons. I think I would have spent some time talking about how the Chinese are organized for these activities, the priority they place on political warfare, influence operations, and how it meshes with their foreign policy overall, but I think that's been very well covered. The second reason I can be brief is I can just refer you to our ongoing work. We have continuing efforts in this area, including a very active database, and I'm not even sure, what's a hashtag?
Influence ops.
Influence,
Hashtag influence
okay.
ops.
So I can refer you to that, and you can see what we're documenting as China's ongoing efforts in this area. But I do want to take a few minutes to talk about Japan and the U.S.-Japan alliance in this context. I think, as Mark pointed out in his remarks, perhaps second only to Taiwan, Japan and the U.S.-Japan alliance would be the second/third priority since we're involved in that. And I think it was very interesting when Xi Jinping visited the United States. I think probably all of us focused on the Washington portion of his visit, maybe because it screwed up our traffic or our commute or something. But if you look at the other aspects of his visit, the visit to Seattle with all the business leaders and the high-tech companies, there's very particular messaging that's involved with that. But what I was interested in, probably more than anything else, was his speech at the United Nations. His speech at the United Nations, he spent an inordinate amount of time talking about history, talking about the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, and by at least implicitly talking about Japan. That's interesting for a couple of reasons. They had a very major event on September 3rd, and one would think they maybe have dispensed with those commemorations and those celebrations. But it's also interesting because when you think about it, world leaders, to include our own president, to include all heads of state, This platform, this opportunity to go before the United Nations at the UN General Assembly is a very significant opportunity to express something, express whatever's on your mind, whatever presumably your major foreign policy goals are. And Xi Jinping chose this. He chose to talk about the 70th anniversary of World War II and history. So I would argue this very much reflects China's foreign policy goals. This is not a stroll down memory lane for memory lane's sake. This is very much integrated with a major foreign policy goal of China. And I think their goal is to see a weakened and diminished U.S. alliance. And I think Dr. Friedberg included that in his remarks, that second only, or maybe it's related to preservation of power for the Communist Party, removing or dealing with obstacles to China's rise to include the U.S.-Japan alliance is a major foreign policy goal. And so I think it's perfectly sensible that Xi Jinping chose to talk about history in his UN General Assembly speech. But the choice of history for China is very, very interesting, and I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about it and maybe encourage us to think about it in a slightly different way than maybe we've been thinking about it during this anniversary year, because I think it's important and I think it's telling. Now, I've probably been influenced by influence operations, so I know as an American you tread very lightly when you talk about history issues in Asia and Northeast Asia. But my purpose here is not to try to describe or capture objective reality. My purpose is not to get into debates about the magnitude of atrocities. My purpose is to suggest for you how China is using history for their foreign policy goals as related to this topic of political warfare influence operations. Because as a starting point, it's quite ironic that China would choose to promote history so much, given how they cover their own history, which is not very well, which is they're probably the greatest abusers of history in terms of distortion, in terms of nullification. Many of us who have gone through the museum attached to Yasukuni Shrine have found things that made us uncomfortable. But if you go through Chinese museums or look at their textbooks, I would suggest, if not equal, I would suggest even more appalling in how some of the history is treated. General Secretary Zhao Ziyang's portrait is not included in the list on the wall with the portraits of the other general secretaries of the Communist Party in the National Museum National Museum of History. No mention of atrocities or suffering during the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution. So that in and of itself is interesting that China would sort of promote history as a major foreign policy tool. But of course they do. And part of this is, Dean said there are multiple audiences, and the first audience is domestic. Certainly that's true. There's an element of trying to promote nationalism or patriotism, and for better or for worse, China has chosen this narrative of century and a half of humiliation and victimization as a way to promote nationalism. And so you have to keep the victimization fresh in people's minds. In a way, it has to be sustained victimization. And so you have to constantly remind people of the atrocities even 70 years ago or longer. So yes, part of this is domestic, but I think very much, as Dean was outlining, the other audiences in Japan, the United States, and the region are very much in mind. And for these audiences, there's two aspects I would suggest of how China's treating and using history. And we're mostly thinking about only one of those aspects. And what I mean by that is what they are promoting for all of our consideration, of course, is the historical era between 1931 and 1945. And that's what sort of comes to the forefront of our mind when you hear the history issue in Asia, right? But there's a second aspect, which is suppressing the last 70 years of history, right? Where Japan's contribution to the Asia-Pacific region, to include their contributions to China development, are quite positive and quite significant and not at all inconsequential. So it's actually both elements. It's the suppressing of the more positive history as well as promotion of the World War II era. And the second part that doesn't get talked about a lot is very important. And I pointed out in an article recently that, Japan is, according to polling, BBC polling, for example, the most admired and respected country in Asia. And oftentimes in those polls has been the most admired and respected country in the world. Well, there's two outliers. There's South Korea, which is an outlier, but not even close to how much of an outlier China is. China is well below the regional average and the global average. So I think there's something else going on there, and I think the empirical evidence supports that, and I think it's not only the promotion of Japan's negative history in World War II, but it's the suppression of the other aspects of Japan's more positive contributions, and we need to remember that. I often tell Americans when somebody wants to talk about the history issue with us, we should be more insistent on, okay, we'll talk about the history issue, but let's talk about it in its full spectrum. Let's talk about it in terms of the last 70 years as well. So there's those aspects, but what are the themes and what are the content and what's China trying to get at? Well, clearly they're also trying to link history to the present and trying to be evocative and trying to create impressions of a trajectory. And so it's closely linked when you hear and you see stories and you read about Japan's unwillingness to accept the verdicts of history. Prime Minister Abe won't accept, he's trying to refute Potsdam and Cairo. That Japan is becoming more nationalistic and is remilitarizing, and all these themes, it's usually linked with history. And part of that, of course, is because of the power and the emotion associated with history. But part of it is because their arguments, just based on the objective facts and merits of what they're describing, remilitarization, for example, are so weak if they're not linked at all to these more emotional and other painful memories of World War II. How can you claim a country is remilitarizing when they've raised their defense budget once, now twice, for the first time and second time in over a decade, and only by about 1%? I mean, how can you call that remilitarization? Well, you can only do that if you link it with these other more, I would say, emotive sort of images of history. So they're trying to create the linkages with a trajectory, and then they're trying to use those feelings and impressions to target various audiences. And they're targeted audiences in Japan, but also the United States. With Japan, they're very much trying to ally with certain constituencies, very strong, of course, pacifist constituency, but also political leaders. And I think it's sort of unfair to name names, but there are very prominent ex-officials in Japan who travel frequently to China and are critical of the steps that the current Japanese government is taking, and they very much sound these same themes and promote these historical narratives that the Chinese political warfare apparatus is promoting. So they're trying to create divisions and trying to really discredit what I think would be otherwise fairly benign and fairly normal steps for a country to take, particularly one facing the security challenges that Japan faces. But they have very important targets in the United States as well. And for the U.S., they're trying to create impressions that we're somehow involved in an unholy or tawdry relationship, an unreliable security partner, one that doesn't accept the verdict of history, one that in the Chinese language, of course, China benefits from the fact that very few Americans speak or read Chinese. But in some of the Chinese language materials, it gets even more extreme that Japan is involved in a long process to fool us. They are intent on finding revenge for Pearl Harbor. I mean, some very outrageous things. But even the English language sources, the attempt is to try to create wedges and drive a wedge between Tokyo and Washington. And I would think, to this administration's credit, there's been a full-on effort, a full onslaught during this anniversary year, and we've accomplished some very important things in this year with the Joint Defense Guidelines, the visit of Prime Minister Abe and his, I would say, successful speech before the joint session of Congress and so forth. So there are, as Aaron was suggesting, there are ways to either mitigate the influence and impact, or maybe even engage in activities that are better at countering those efforts. But I think the administration on the alliance has done a good job. But clearly it's not abating, and I think Xi Jinping's visit and his speech at the UN are evidence of that. And it's very subtle, but also this attempted, if I could use an overused word in Asia, pivot to talking about this new security concept, new model of great power relations. This is also very much directed at the U.S.-Japan alliance, because that's the old system. That's the anachronistic system built for the Cold War. And so when they talk about a new model of great power relations, it's about U.S.-China cooperation. It's about perhaps a roadmap to something similar to a G2. But it's certainly about leaving Japan behind and leaving the U.S.-Japan alliance behind. So again, I didn't want to take a lot of time because we are running a bit behind schedule. But I did want to refer people to our ongoing work in this area. I think you'll find a lot of very rich material about China's efforts in this area, and just suggest that we need to think a little more broadly about history and the uses of Chinese political warfare in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. So at this time, I would like to invite Dr. Aaron Freeberg and Mark Stokes back on stage for Q&A. We will have about 15 minutes. We have a hard stop at 4:05 in order for us to welcome Congressman Forbes. So if you guys can make your way up.
What do you want us to do?
Together?
Okay. Move down. Aaron, why don't you go down?
So I will start us off with the first question. Thank you for the regional overview to our panelists. Given that Chinese political warfare is not illegal or immoral per se, how can we differentiate between Chinese political warfare with what is more normally considered public diplomacy practices that's normal for most countries? And I will address this question to Dr. Freeberg or Dean.
Well, first, I think it's much more systematic than is common for certainly for most democratic countries, which engage in some forms of public diplomacy and public relations, but not nearly on the level that the Chinese do. Secondly, I think it involves elements and instruments which are not fully transparent. This is part of the point that I was trying to make. So I think it's different in those respects. And of course, it's different in part because it's an instrument of an authoritarian regime that is itself not transparent, whose motives and intentions are not fully and clearly understood. So in that sense, it's quite different, I think, than what, I don't know, Britain does in trying to promote the British positions on various issues of policy that may be relevant to people in the United States. Much more extensive and I think much deeper.
I think I'd also add, particularly in the case of democracies, that we invite people here, and for better or worse, they get to see us warts and all. If you have been, if you're a foreigner and you've been here for, say, the past year to 2 years, you've seen riots in places like Ferguson. You have seen tragedy in places like Baltimore, as well as, hopefully, you've seen some better sides of the United States. We are not restricting what it is that you see. All you have to do is turn on your television, and you are not being fed a particular set of channels, unless your cable provider has decided to restrict your cable package. But the reality is that visitors and others to places like China are being fed a particular diet. Everyone is trying to influence people. That is neither illegal nor should it be surprising. The question is, how far are you willing to go to shape that perception, and how far is the end product from objective reality? And I would suggest that a systematic effort to create, particularly when it is run along military lines, a systematic effort to create a different reality is different from public diplomacy, which is trying to get your message across to sort of broadly shape, and to make people more predisposed.
Thank you, Dean. And one more question before we turn it to the floor. This is for Shizhong or Mark. How is Chinese political warfare targeting actors in Washington, D.C., towards the U.S.-Taiwan relationship?
Yeah, of course. For example, in the second stage I referred to in my presentation, that was coincided with Chen Shui-bian's second term. I think U.S.-Taiwan relation and in that period ran into some trouble because of lack of trust and miscommunications. And of course, Beijing at that time tried to take advantage of that by asking the then Bush administration to sort of put more pressures on Chen Shui-bian to hopefully he could sort of suspend some of his political agendas. So yes, definitely. I think in different kind of stages, especially when it comes to the notion of united front and divide and conquer. Definitely, Beijing has tried, at least during that period of time, very hard to hopefully use Washington to sort of constrain Chen Shui-bian and then DPP administrations. But I'm not saying that Washington has played up to Beijing's game. I think my personal experience exchanging views with the then Bush administration people, including Randy and others, shows that it's more about communications between DPP government and Washington. So I think yes, definitely, and not to mention that this time when the DPP presidential candidate Madam Tsai Ing-wen visited DC in June, a lot of people expect that there are also Chinese influence behind her trip. But I think Madam Tsai handled this trip very well. She came up with a lot of reassurance to Washington, and that explains why Taiwan issue has not become one of the focal point in the Xi Jinping's meeting with President Obama, and President Obama just reiterate the U.S. policy toward Taiwan based on the Taiwan Relations Act and 3 communiques.
Thank you. Any comments, Mike?
I'd offer just one additional perspective, and that would be, in my view, and again, this is a subjective evaluation, Beijing's goal, the Chinese Communist Party's goal, is to implement their formula for cross-strait unification on their terms. In effect, trying to implement their what's called one country, two systems policy in all but name in Washington, D.C. One country, two systems, of course, there's one China. Taiwan is part of China, and the PRC is the sole representative of China in the international system. The concept, for example, of shared sovereignty. There's no way you can have sort of, in other words, this concept of a zero-sum game in terms of legitimacy. Whereas right now our one China policy, of course, is that we acknowledge Beijing's position that there's one China and Taiwan is part of one China. But when I say implement the one country, two systems policy in all but name, basically through at least presenting the impression that that Beijing is co-managing our relations with Taiwan. It's very important trying to create the impression. I don't see any indication this is the case. In terms of taking a level down in terms of what appears to be, in terms of how they want to do this or appear to be trying to do this is between 2008 until maybe 2011, 2012, there appeared to be a campaign to effect a quote-unquote thoughtful review of the Taiwan Relations Act, or at a minimum to be able to try to try to influence through one way or another a review of the two security-related provisions of the Taiwan Relations Act, which are the provision of necessary defense articles and services, and the second is maintain the capacity to resist use of force and other forms of coercion, which these are the two aspects of the TRA that perhaps are most bothersome to the CCP. And also bear in mind the TRA actually is sort of flies in the face of their goal of trying to put themselves as the sole legitimate government of one China, or just simply the legitimate government. So I would argue that that would be sort of a key goal in what they're trying to do.
Thank you, Mark. So we return it to the floor for the next 5 minutes. Sir in the blue shirt, please wait for a mic and state your name and affiliation.
Hi, Patton Adams with VeriSign iDefense. A question particularly for Dean, but anybody else could answer. You mentioned informationized warfare as the extension of information technology to warfare. To what degree has political warfare been informationized or is in the process of being informationized? Now, I would point particularly to an example of something that came up recently. The American Civil Liberties Union blogged recently about the Chinese Citizen Score, which is the application of information about Chinese citizens' online purchases and online comments and things as a basis for the extension of state privileges like passports and other things, and that it's published so others can see it as well. Is this an example of a new tool that's kind of in their quiver that may be extended beyond Chinese borders to foreigners as well?
Absolutely. Political warfare has been informationized. So if you take a look at some of the recent cyber hacks, and I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that the Chinese may have been responsible for each of the following. The OPM hack, 30 million items. What does that give you? It gives you a lot of information about these people who are U.S. government workers. But in and of itself, that's a treasure trove of data. But let me mate that, no pun intended, with the Ashley Madison hack. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, Ashley Madison is an online site to allow people to have affairs. If I link those two databases, and there were by chance, say, a few government people who happened to be going to Ashley Madison to have affairs, I now have not only an immediate source of people that I would want to potentially pull into my espionage net, but I am now also going to be able to pressure you in the context of blackmail and the rest. But writ large, it also creates a sense of how secure are my networks? How well can I conduct business? How well can I conduct sensitive affairs if there are bad guys, say the Chinese, running through my systems? That is part of the psychological warfare aspect of political warfare. The fact that other people may be able to access information, say, about my banking, my family. In time of crisis or conflict, if I were a deployed soldier and I started getting emails from my family saying, our bank account just went to zero and mortgage payments are due, or somebody started sending me pictures of my children coming and going from school, that could be a very powerful, now that's more at a more tactical level. But all of this are just some very quick examples of how information warfare can be applied to political warfare.
Thank you, Dean. Sir in the black shirt.
Behind you.
Michael Yehuda, formerly from the LSE in London and now with GW. It seems to me that there's one other target for the Chinese information warfare, and that is the people they regard as fellow descendants of the Yellow Emperor. The Chinese authorities for a long time have not really accepted Chinese who have become citizens of another country as being, in fact, no longer under their influence. And in Australia, there's evidence that came from a defector from a Chinese embassy that a principal target has been students from the People's Republic. And Australia, as you know, is one of the major countries to which Chinese students go. And this has had a notable effect on how except when a Chinese leader comes to Australia.
Sir, can you state your question, please?
In
Thank
addition
you.
to which, it's made known to them that they have families back in China. And I'm sure this must happen here. Is there evidence of this sort of thing happening here?
I believe it's fairly common knowledge. Nicholas F. Demiades wrote an interesting book on Chinese intelligence operations, for example, that the Chinese do indeed target overseas Chinese populations around the world. Blood calls out to blood is one of the arguments. I suspect that that has as much traction, however, as any kind of ethnic appeal does, which is different from saying, do the Chinese target versus are they effective? I think that it would be a very useful mistake in favor of the Chinese to assume that if you are, if you look, say, like me, that in that case I must therefore be in the employ of the Chinese Ministry of State Security. Let me go on the record here and say that I am not in the employ of the Chinese Ministry of State Security or the PLA.
So we'll take one last question before we move into the last set. Go ahead, sir.
Hi, Will Yale, adjunct fellow at the American Security Project. And yesterday I was on a panel at a CEFC conference. And so it was an interesting adventure into the heart of Chinese influence operations. And just a comment and then two questions. You know, I thought it was interesting. It really mirrored everything that Aaron Freeberg, all of the aims and messages, China, accept China is equal, acquiesce to China, China's weak, China's strong. But there's also a mirror message creating a false dichotomy that there's only two options for U.S. policy, either to contain or to accommodate, and that no U.S. policy could deter or influence Chinese behavior. The two questions I have really are delving deeper into the network of individuals tying the official bureaucracy to the unofficial organizations. Who are we talking about? What are the exact links? And the second, I also want to dig into the relationship these organizations have with the American Old Friends. Last night, I'm not going to name names, but at dinner, they had a former National Security Advisor, a former CIA director, and a retired vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. None of them have substantial policy influence over the current administration. Some have business interests in China, but others I thought would be opposed, actually, to Chinese interests in, as far as the CESC is regarded. So, what are really the motivations, on both sides? Inviting people who don't have policy influence, and on the other side, accepting invitations when it's really quite, damaging. I guess it's quite,
Well, just very quickly, as far as the networks are concerned, I mean, this is something that I think actually deserves a bit more attention. And it's become, I think, easier for the Chinese authorities to make use of entities which are private or appear to be private, or which in an American context might really be private, but in fact are, to one degree or another, under the control of the authorities or subject to their wishes. So certainly that's true for state-owned enterprises, but then these foundations that have funding from companies whose livelihoods depend on standing well with Beijing, presumably they're, if not being directed, they know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. So it's gotten more complicated. And this blurriness between private and public, it's blurry for us because we have a very clear concept of what those spheres are, is something that the Chinese can take advantage of. And their system is different. These two are intermingled. And we've seen this issue arise, for example, in the discussion of whether Huawei should be allowed to invest in the United States as a private company. Yes, it has links to the PLA. So I think there's something there that deserves further examination. I'm not sure I understood the second question, but I guess maybe if I could paraphrase it, It's what are these people thinking when they're there? Well, I ask myself the same question. And I think there are a variety of different answers. Some are people, I think, just feel that it's important to engage in dialogue and discussion. Some people, I'm not saying any of the people attending this meeting may be what the Soviets used to refer to as unwitting dupes. You know, they may not quite know that they're being used. Some people have followed a very lucrative career path after they've been in government, doing business with companies that are doing business in China, if not with Chinese companies. And that's something that has an influence on the way people think. Up until recently, I would say there's been this kind of harmonic convergence that allowed people to feel that they were doing well by doing good. You know, promoting peace and understanding between the United States and China, and oh, by the way, it's very good business. Well, I think it's gotten tougher and tougher to sustain those two things because of the way the Chinese have been behaving. But I don't see, well, maybe you see a little bit more caution now on the part of some former military people about being involved in enterprises that they might a few years ago have considered taking part in. But it's very tempting for people, I think. And when it appears to be not only harmless but good, why not?
Any other comments?
Just very, very quickly, it's a good, it's good, these are good questions. I use a term for organizations like China Energy Fund Committee or China Association for International Friendly Contact and others. I refer to them as platforms for a reason. In the old Soviet days, when the term used to be front organization. I think that's too strong in this case. Because from what I can see, they're perhaps corporatist type relationships where there's not a subordinate relationship, but certainly they use various platforms. The only way to really trace it down is to look at sort of the leadership structure and those that are associated with these organizations, and to find their do social network analysis and try to find their other hats. Let me give you an example. I mean, the guy that clearly has a lot of influence and is not even a member of the Chinese Communist Party is a guy named Xu Jialu, who is a senior advisor to China Energy Fund Committee. He is a senior advisor to China Association of Friendly Contact. He's the head of an organization called the China Association for Promotion of and Development of Chinese Culture, which is very much cross-strait related. And so trying to trace these connections and the networks to me is the only way to really sort of draw and then try to analyze how it works. In terms of what their goal is on inviting a lot of sort of retired U.S. officials, I think we all may know they probably don't have a lot of influence, but that may be secondary to what the real goal is. And the real goal is for that organization, for themselves to gain legitimacy by at least creating the impression there's association between them and former CIA director, former NSA director, or former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and so to me that may be more important. But I can address more thoughts later.
Thank you, Mark. So now we're going to move into our last segment with Congressman Forbes. I will invite the Congressman up, and Randy will be giving an introduction.
Yes, and thank our panel. We're very honored this afternoon to be joined by Congressman Randy Forbes. Congressman Forbes has served on the House Armed Services Committee for the past 14 years, and he currently serves as the chairman of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee. He was a member of the Readiness Subcommittee as both chair and ranking member from 2009 to 2012. Really one of the, I would say, lead thinkers on defense issues in our country, a real stalwart fighting sequestration and being an advocate for ensuring our military forces are prepared for the challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. He also has a deep background on China and U.S.-China relations. He was one of the founders of the Congressional China Caucus. I would also note, I don't see it in his bio here, he was a founder of the Prayer Caucus, which I consider very important in U.S.-China relations also. I think it's one of the key things as we talk about themes and values and how we are juxtaposed against China. But again, a real honor for us to have, I think, one of the strategic thinkers on both defense issues and on China. Please help me welcome Congressman Randy Forbes.
Randy, thank you. And, it's interesting. I won't talk about it today, but when you mentioned even the Congressional Prayer Caucus and the impact with China, really some of our contacts with Hu Jintao and other things were directly related to the Congressional Prayer Caucus, and a lot of people don't realize it because of the religious freedom and religious liberty aspects of there. But I just appreciate, having this today. I looked at all the speakers that you had, and I was a little bit envious that I didn't get a chance to be here and listen to many of them, because sometimes just by osmosis you pick up incredibly great tidbits and ideas, and these were some remarkable speakers. And for all of you being in here, I wanted to just start by telling you how much I appreciate both the Heritage Foundation and the 2049 group for creating a marketplace of ideas. And that is so important, I think, in the environment we're living in today. We sometimes take that phrase for granted, but it's incredibly important. And, I've reached that point in time in my life, and maybe even my career, where I don't have to be politically correct anymore, and that really is kind of a releasing valve. But the second thing is you start to get some perceptions of things that you might not have had 10 years ago or even 15 years ago. And one of the perceptions is from even being a member of Congress, what you bring to the table. It's not that you have the expertise that so many of the speakers that you had today might bring here, but one of the things that truly is interesting is this. From studying the military, as Randy mentioned, and I do spend most of my time studying and analyzing national defense issues in our military, I go through over and over again the organizational charts we have of our national defense, and I say, this isn't really the way it works. This is the person that really makes this happen. But it takes a long period of time, and one of the things that really is amazing to me is I can have an admiral who can be absolutely brilliant on his sphere and what he's running through, and he really doesn't know a great deal about what this admiral over here is doing. So one of the good things as a member of Congress you get to do is kind of just be exposed to these different opinions and people, and all of a sudden you can create a picture sometime that unites them together. The second thing that I would kind of caution you is sometimes we get so analytical that we write meanings into things where there are no meanings. So, for example, if you look at the book The Wizard of Oz, and when they called it Oz, there were so many theories written about what Oz meant until finally the author acknowledged he was just writing and needed a name, and he looked at the file cabinet and it was O to Z, so he picked Oz. It wasn't any big thing. But sometimes as we analyze the thought behind this, I'll look at some things that happened in Congress, and I read all the analysis of why it happened. I mean, that's not why it happened at all. It just happened. But then what you find is sometimes, even though it wasn't planned that way, all of a sudden it can have an impact by default almost that creates a function and something we need to look at. So when we're looking at this whole topic you've been studying, and we start talking about political warfare, and you're looking at the Asia-Pacific area, I think one of the things that seems more and more clear to us is that we find ourselves in a period of time where there is long-term strategic competition with China, whether we like it or not, but even more importantly, whether we talk about it or not. And for the longest period of time, we had to fight with the Pentagon and people in Congress because we had this kind of mentality that if we didn't say it, it wasn't going to happen. So you remember we stopped talking about the war on terrorism because we didn't want to mention terrorism. We thought if we just didn't say anything about terrorism, there wouldn't be any terrorism. And for the longest time, some of the best thinkers that we had, the Pentagon and other places, felt like if we didn't talk about there being competition with China, somehow or the other they weren't going to compete with us, And we kept saying, none of that makes sense. We need to create that marketplace and talk about what's really happening. And I know Professor Friedberg, it was a kickoff speaker, and I know he's written, it's become increasingly difficult to escape the conclusion that Beijing's ultimate aim is to displace the United States and resume its traditional position as the preponderant power in Asia. And that's something that it was almost difficult for us to even talk about just a short time ago. But I mean, all you have to do is kind of look around and take that remote control, as us males in here know, we can watch multiple channels at one time. And so you just flip that through, and as you see the world, we see the Chinese military parade, and we see what they're parading out, and most of those things are designed for us. We look at the 3,000 acres of artificial land that they have been developing now that we can build runways on for B-52s. We look at stolen files of 21 million federal employees. And we look at the influence operations that you've been talking about today. All that starts painting a picture that makes it very, very clear that these are topics we at least need to put on the table and start talking about. Now, one of the things that's really important, though, and it's been hard for us, when we started the Congressional China Caucus over a decade ago, one of the things that hit us was we came back and we really looked at subcommittees and we looked at committees because we wanted to find the committee that was really driving these ideas and issues. And I'll tell you, they weren't there. There were no hearings taking place. Nobody was doing anything. And Ike Skelton, who was a former member of Congress, some of you might have known, Ike was at one time the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He was a Democrat. I was a Republican, but we were very, very good friends. And we went to China, and I told Ike on the way back, I said, one thing's for sure, they know a lot more about us than we know about them, and we need to come back and change it. And so Ike and I tried to find which, again, subcommittee was doing it. We realized there were none. So we created the Congressional China Caucus, not to be pro-China or anti-China, but to really be a clearinghouse for ideas. So by either inspiration or jealousy or competition or whatever it was, we could kind of spawn more discussion and, again, help birth some of that marketplace of ideas. And the reason it's so important is because we know now, we hear about this strategic pivot or rebalance, if that makes you feel more comfortable, to use that phraseology, to the Asia-Pacific area. But the reality is, if I had Admiral Harris here, very, very good combatant commander, he would draw you a circle, and he would say more people live in that circle that he has under his influence than live outside that circle. When you look at the fact that we're going to have by 2030, as all of you know in here, $3 billion of trade in the middle class in that region, that's $7 trillion, or 40% of global trade goes through the Strait of Malacca, it just begins to show the importance of this whole region and what we're looking at. But one of the things we have to be careful with is that many people, as you begin to talk about what China is doing and actually doing, and then you use phrases like political warfare, people love to immediately come back because we've got a whole taboo of words we can't use today, a whole taboo of topics we can't use, and they love to quickly come back out and reel out a phrase like Cold War and say, oh, wait a minute, are you going back to the Cold War? Are you being a Cold War warrior? And you're not. But what you have to realize is if some of the things that we saw during the Cold War are beginning to manifest themselves and repeat, at least we have to put those things on the table and talk about them. And that's what this has been so important to do. Let me also tell you this. I am a big person on strategy. I just think as you look back, if you bring a couple of brilliant people up here, if I could bring Andy Marshall over here, you remember who was so often the director of Office of Net Assessment, or Stephen Hadley, they would tell you one of the biggest challenges and weaknesses we have in the United States today is we don't do strategy anymore. And so when I'm looking at the Asia-Pacific area, and I have anybody, including any of you guys in here, who I have enormous respect from any of the people coming in, or anybody from the administration or from the Pentagon, and they're talking about the Asia-Pacific area, what I try to do is be very polite and listen to them for as long as they want to talk, based on whatever amount of time that we have. But then, whenever there's a break in the action, I just look at them and I ask them 3 questions. I just said, can you tell me what our strategy is in the Asia-Pacific area? Can you tell me if we're winning or losing? And can you tell me the metrics you use to measure that by? And I will tell you, in almost every situation, you know what happens? There's this pause, and they do this. And that sigh is meant to say, I'm so much smarter than you are, and I couldn't possibly convey this to you. And then they come back with this. They come back with this. It's just really complicated. And I want to tell them, and many times I do know, because like I said, I don't have to be politically correct anymore. I say, I live with complicated. Give me some of it. you know? And it's very difficult for us because I question sometimes what is our strategy, especially in dealing with political warfare. If we can't even talk about political warfare, if we can't even lay it on the table, if we can't even ask the questions, how in the world can we develop a strategy to deal with it? And that's whether we want to engage in it or not. The other thing is, I think it's important, we can't have an effective strategy unless we can have ideas. And you can't have good ideas unless we can have a discussion, a debate. And you can't have that discussion, debate unless you have a marketplace of ideas. And that's what you do so well, I think, in conferences like this. The other thing I want to point out to you is I think it's absolutely critically important that we not only look at what's happening in political warfare, but we look at maintaining a military balance that will help deter the kind of aggression we're seeing. Because here's the way I assess most of what's going on in the world today. If we look at President Putin today, President Putin is not a strategist. He's an opportunist. And by an opportunist, I don't mean that negatively. I mean that as just a descriptive phrase. He can't be a strategist very well because he got rid of most of his thinkers and people who disagreed with him when he came into office. And so he finds an area and he moves into that area. Then he assesses the situation and where it is, and then he makes a decision from there. Chinese do a great job at strategic thinking, whether you like what they do or not. If you went there today and you asked them, do you have a strategy? They'd say yes. If you say what it is, they could tell you what it is. And if you told them whether they were, asked them whether they were winning or losing, they could give you metrics for it, unlike where we are. I think, unfortunately, we've become more reactionary, where we wait until something happens, and then we try to create a response to what happened. But it's very, very dangerous for us to do that, and I think nowhere is it more dangerous than we look at our military presence and what's happening there. We need to make sure we're modernizing our military. And I'll just give you two quotes from two presidents, whether it's Kennedy or whether it's Reagan. Kennedy had and I'm paraphrasing just because I'm not smart enough to remember it exactly, but Kennedy said, only when we have arms sufficient without doubt will we know we will not have to use them without doubt. Pretty eerily close to Reagan's peace through strength. But one of the things both presidents realized is if you didn't want to go to war, you better be strong enough to make sure you deter anybody from having those conflicts kind of develop. We also have to constantly be thinking about new capabilities and concepts. You can't buy our way through this whole situation that's taking place. We can't outbuild our way. So we've got to constantly be creating new capabilities and new strategies. And I will tell you, with all the bad criticism we have of folks at the Pentagon, we've got some brilliant people doing some great thinking in some of those terms right now. But I will also tell you this. We've got to be very careful about having the right American leadership around the globe. And this is not intended to be a partisan comment, although it is. But let me just share this with you. I have never in my career, you can believe this or not, had more world leaders, whether it's the actual leader of the country, prime minister, president, whatever it is, or their ambassador or their defense minister coming to visit me than I've had in the last year or 2 years. And to the person now, they send out their staff, which is not what they normally do because they love to have their staffs in the room. They bring these entourages in. And they look at me and say, we don't have a clue what the American strategy is today. And it's hard for us to make acquisition decisions and procurement decisions, but it seems like all these things that are happening in the world is because of a lack of American leadership. And let me just give you 3 examples of that. How do you say we are going to snub one of our best allies, whether you like them or not, Israel, and snub them, basically, in our office, give $100 billion to one of our potentially worst enemies in Iran, and then the third thing, say we're going to be strong around the globe, but then say this, I am going to veto the very bill that authorizes my military unless I can get what I want with the Internal Revenue Service and EPA and all those other kinds of things. And here's the impact of that, real-world impacts. The impact of vetoing that bill, which may very well happen within weeks, is we'll lose 3 destroyers, 2 attack subs, 3 littoral combat ships, an amphibious ship, and we'll delay the Air Force bomber program and the Air Force tanker program. And you have to say, what kind of image is that putting around the globe? And the reason it's important is this. When the president made his trip to the Asia-Pacific area not too long ago, many of you remember, I can't tell you how many of our allies told me the only thing they saw was the budget that was sent over, where they were taking an aircraft carrier out of the budget. And to them, it was like a neon sign going off, are you really going to be here and have a presence here? But we all know it's not just about military presence. It's about many of the topics you guys have talked about today. Stolen blueprints to the F-35, fingerprints of 5.6 million government employees. The CSIS estimates that $500 billion in intellectual property was stolen each year. We see this huge movement with their Coast Guard now. Pretty smart move by them. I mean, they're only 60 ships short in their Coast Guard of what we have in our Navy. And yet they kind of have the strategic advantage because we don't have a good strategy for coping with how they use their Coast Guards right now, because we don't want to escalate by bringing in one of our naval ships. And I showed in a hearing the other day, I believe it was Admiral Locklear, if I'm not mistaken, Eric, that was in there, but I showed him two pictures. One of them was a ship painted blue and orange, and one of them was a ship painted gray. Other than that, they're exactly the same ship, but one of them's in the Chinese Coast Guard, one's the amphibious ship that they're using in the Navy, and the exact same ships. They're building up their Coast Guard with that, so they can use the same ship. Then if we bring in a gray ship, or gray hull, they say, wait a minute, the United States is escalating. We've got to find a strategy for dealing with that. And then they use very well controlled friction. China loves to create a friction, and then they'll take that 2 steps, take 1 step back, and everybody says, oh, look, they're not moving now, but they've already gotten their positions. And you know, I mean, does anybody really think we're going to move them back off of that 3,000 acres they've claimed now? Very, very controlled thing that we haven't had a strategy about it yet. So some things we need to do. One of the things back in the 80s we did have, we required from congressionally the State Department to monitor what the Soviets were doing on some of their active measures and political warfare and other things, and we may need to start asking to do the same thing on China. But the big thing, I think, is we need to start doing more strategic thinking on what kind of cost imposition strategies that we need to have. And then the last thing is we've got to be very, very careful about losing this rhetorical war, because words do matter. It took me 22 minutes, as I recall, to get the Attorney General under President Bush to acknowledge that China was our #1 espionage problem. He just didn't want to say the words. And if you guys watch many hearings, you know we normally only have 5 minutes to question a witness, and they've become masterful at how you run out the clock, you know. And so I finally had to tell him, I said, Mr. Attorney General, I know you're going to run out the clock. I said, the problem with this, look to the chairman. He's already said, I'm the guy on this. He's going to give me all the time that I need. There is no clock on this. I'm going to keep asking the question until you just answer. And he finally said, yes, they're the #1 espionage problem we have. Couldn't even talk about it and put it on the table. The other thing is when they get us using words like islands versus artificial features, that's a big difference. And we've got to be careful with it. When they talk about freedom of navigation versus freedom of the seas, that's a big difference. And we need to make sure that when they take some of these measures, that we're also having some repercussions. Because if you're China and every time you do something and there's no repercussion at all, what would you do? If you were the president of a company and came back to your board of directors, you'd say, we need to push a little bit stronger. And that's why many of us actually signed a letter asking the president to move into some of this 12-mile zone and actually do some navigation movements through there, which, quite honestly, I think Admiral Harris probably wanted to do anyway, but hopefully we gave a little bit of cover because I'm hoping we're going to see that happen. And, of course, Joe Wilson and I have pushed with a letter to say that we need to have some repercussions on some of the cyber situations that are taking place, whatever those repercussions were. And let me just close with this. And I think this is more important than we give it credit for. In this whole rhetorical battle that we have, we've allowed ourselves to have words today in America that are just taboo, and we can't even talk about them. Phrases I talked about earlier, it just bothered me so much. The CNO is a former CNO, Admiral Greenert, wonderful man. He did a wonderful job as CNO. I consider him a very good personal friend. But, when they were at the War College and we had a young officer stand up and ask him in a very, very sincere way, how do we talk about Chinese competition? And the Admiral said to even talk about China as a competitor goes across the line and goes too far. And everybody, if you watch that video, they all start laughing. They thought he was joking. And then he doubled down and said, no, he's serious. And I both called him and sent him a note and said, what are you thinking about? I said, if they can censor even the words we use, my gosh, how do they think that we're going to be strong enough to do anything in Taiwan or some of these other areas? And one of the words that really bother me now is that you hear so much about Chinese destiny. You know, it's something that's very important to them. They've talked about it for a long period of time, thousands of years of destiny, and that's where we have this right because of our destiny. And what bothers me is not that they talk about that. They've got a right to talk about that. What worries me is we don't talk about our destiny anymore as America. And I was with Tony Blair not too long ago. He invited me to have lunch with him. We were talking about defense issues that were there. And he looked and he said this that I thought was very important. He said, you know, I've probably seen more terrorism than almost any world leader around the globe. He said, and I have this huge admiration for the United States. And I love some of your states like Indiana and Indiana and Iowa and some of the Midwest states. He said, but I've never been there. But I always realized that this morning in those states, there are men and women getting up and they're going to work in those beautiful areas, and they have to be asking this question. They have to be asking, why us? Why should we care what's going on in the Asia-Pacific area or the Middle East or any place else? And he said, you know, Randy, he said, the reason's pretty simple. Because it's their destiny. Because America has a destiny. But here's the difference. Our destiny is not to be the big country and say to everybody else, you're the little country. Our destiny is not to have huge parades of military strength. Our destiny, and this is what Tony Blair said, he said, your destiny is to do good around the world. And you do good around the world. And I want to tell you guys today, Americans need to be talking more about our destiny, because how we handle this marketplace of ideas, these concepts, these ideas, determine a lot about the destiny we have. And the destiny that we have determines a lot about good around the world. I'll close with this. I had a general from Canada that wanted to meet with me one day, and my staff told him we just didn't have time. He's too many other meetings, and I found out about it, and I said, no, I want to meet with him. He had some of our troops with our troops, and I want to meet with him. Walks into my office, you know, one of these old salts. I mean, just, you know, skin that never used the right cleansers and all. I mean, he's just like leather, you know. And he walks right past me, and he didn't say hi, he didn't say anything. The back of my wall, I have a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the 56 signers. And he just stares at it for about 5 minutes. He turns around literally with this tear kind of coming down his eye. I'm getting nervous. I mean, this is a tough guy. And he said, I just came to thank you for what you're doing. He said, because you can't fail. He said, because if the United States fails, he said, the world doesn't have anybody to come around to protect freedom and protect all the things that are good in the world. That's why we have to win. That's why we have to have these debates and get these concepts right, because we do have a destiny, and no one should convince us not to talk about it. So thank you guys for letting me be here with you today.
The Congressman has graciously agreed to take a few questions, so we'll just open the field. I think we still have a microphone. Yep. Joe?
Joe Bosco, formerly with the Defense Department. Hi, Congressman. Thank you for all you do in this area.
Thank you, Joe.
I wonder if you could link together your point about the letter on freedom of navigation to what we heard today on political warfare. It seems to me that China is succeeding in convincing the international community, or at least that part of the community that's in the White House, that if we do anything in the area of freedom of navigation to assert our rights, we are being provocative. And I think that message is a dangerous one, and I wonder if you think that's catching on.
I don't think it's a matter, Joe, whether it's catching on. I think you and I would agree it's already caught on, you know. And unfortunately, the question is not whether the messaging takes on. We'll never compete in that political warfare the way some other countries were. You know, if you had Don Rumsfeld here, he would tell you that during the Iraq War, he just carried some reporters over. And he didn't tell me, he just wanted to have reporters over there just to be able to look at what was going on, write their own story however they want. And he was really almost castigated because they were saying he was trying to change opinion, and he wasn't trying to change opinion, he was just trying to bring some reporters over there to write whatever they wanted to write. When we travel around the globe, you've done the same thing, I go in and watch some news accounts around the world, and I think if I watched that all the time, I would hate the United States too, to do that. I mean, literally there are people in Russia today who think the United States invaded Ukraine, not the Russians do. And so I think the question for us is not whether they're going to succeed in convincing a lot of people that, but I think the question is whether that stops us from doing what we think is right to do. And I think that's why I say we need American leadership. And American leadership has always been not for people to pat us on the back and say, oh, we agree with you, but for us to do what we think is the right thing to do for the world order that we think is important. Because let me tell you, the most dangerous thing that could happen in the Asia-Pacific area is to have two world orders, to have two kind of political powers that are going in there. I think it's important for us to realize there is a huge difference between saying, I'm a big country, you're a small country, and between saying, we're a big country, but the rule of law is bigger than all of us, and we want to pull it together. That's why I think it's so important, not that we have to beat them at their game, but we can't let their game change the direction of what we want to do. But you're absolutely correct. I think what it has done is paralyzed some of the decision-making that takes place because we're looking domestically sometime at polls much more than we are at what we need to be doing internationally to make sure we're establishing that leadership position. So I'm very concerned, Joe, not about what's happening out there in the public opinion world, but how we're responding to it and how it's impacting. It's having the exact effect Chinese, and by the way, as you know, it's not just the Chinese, but other entities want it to have on us.
A couple of things. First, thank you for having a Congressional Prayer Caucus. I really appreciate that. Number two, Chinese military budget on the increase at a rate of alarming level. I don't know how much you can comment on it, but to me, it's really alarming. So can you
I think we have to be careful because let me tell you what we do in the United States a lot of times. We look at a snapshot of today and we extrapolate that out and think that's going to be forever. We all remember in the 90s when we looked at our Japanese friends and we all thought, oh boy, they have this down, and we thought that was going to be, the new kind of paradigm that we'd be looking at. When you look at the Chinese military spending, it is huge now. And it's geometrically increasing. The other thing is, we can't measure it all because it's not a very transparent budgeting process, and there's an interconnectivity. But I will say this, at least the experts that we have brought before my committee and the questioning we've had, I don't think that's an unlimited time period that they will have that kind of economic ability to spend those monies. We could be wrong, but let's say it's a decade. I think what we have to recognize is we can't control their military spending. We can't get their military spending down. But I think what we can do is this, to say, how do we slow it down from having the dollar spent in places that would harm us the most over at least the next decade? And what we do there, and what we have done well in the past and could do well again, is if we create certain strategies, we can then have cost imposition strategies that make them spend their money in other places instead of allowing them to focus it in on us. We're not even in that ball game today, but we could play it very well. Let me just give you a couple of examples. When we create relationships with our allies, it really makes the Chinese spend money in a lot of other areas because they don't know what's going to happen. And all of a sudden, they'll spend dollars at places that's not going to be as detrimental to us. So what I would say is, we can't be around telling them how much to spend for defense. We can't do that. I mean, we don't do that very well, and we couldn't do it if we wanted to. What we can do is to, first of all, recognize what they're spending, recognize the impact that could have on us. And then the third thing is create those kind of offset strategies and cost imposition strategies that would slow the rate of some of their military buildup down for that decade or so to see if the economic things kind of level out. And I think that's the ball game we're not playing in that we should be playing.
Maybe a couple more?
Sure, sure.
John Cordero, Center for Security Policy.
Hi, John.
Thank you, Congressman, for your talk. My question is, with the recently signed TPP deal, Trans-Pacific Partnership, what tactics can we expect from China? Obviously, they're excluded, and what can we expect from them going forward, whether we approve the deal or not? But obviously, what will they try to do?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sure you had a lot of good discussions about some of the things they're doing. I mean, the Chinese right now doing pretty effective jobs at, if they can influence a government, which sometimes they can't, they can do pretty good jobs at going in and buying a corporation or something and influencing the local governors, you know, or the local authorities to then have some friction between them and the governor, I mean, the authorities in the country. I think we'll see continued that happening. I think one of the things, though, that the TPP does for us, all of those guys that I told you would come into my office, those, you know, our allies and friends around the globe, if I asked them the number one security concern they had, it would not be more submarines, it would not be an aircraft carrier, it wouldn't be a different kind of plane. To the person, it would be trade. They think trade is that important for national security reasons. So I think the TPP is going to be vitally important for national security. But I think China's going to continue to do what they do, which is to try to invest huge sums of money in areas, and they're pretty effective at it. Now, the last thing I'll tell you, though, we always look at what China's doing and what we're worried about. Let me tell you two of the good things that are there. One of the things is that still our culture, just the way our culture is versus their culture, they have a very difficult time competing with us on innovation. I mean, innovation is still a huge advantage we have, and it's not because the government's doing all these great things, because it's just a culture. It's a different culture. The problem with innovation we've got to watch out for is unleveling the playing field so bad that our innovation can't continue to lead. The other thing that they don't do well is build coalitions. And I think TPP is going to continue to help us create those coalitions. And I think even with the money they're investing, they have a hard time building those coalitions, because let me tell you something. You and I, John, could be very, very good friends. But if you walk into me at the end of the day and say, I'm a big guy, I'm an important guy, and you're not, and you need to live with it, hard for you and I to have that kind of partnership. And that's kind of what China's doing. And as you know, because of some of their activity, they've driven some of those people to us. I think we have to take advantage of that.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg.
Hello,
Breaking
Sidney
Defense.
Friedberg.
Yes,
How are you
hello.
doing? Good.
To ask the if, okay, then what question, let's say that we do sail ships through the 12 nautical mile limit. Let's say we impose some kind of appropriate sanction for the cyber theft. And I'd love to know more about what is on the menu there. So what do they do in response, and what do we do about that? I remember people ran through this exercise of the Cuban Missile Crisis at one point, and it led to, well, if we take the preferred course of action, we will all end up nuking each other, so maybe we should try a different course of action. How does this game play out if we actually press back? Presumably, they don't just fold.
Well, two things. First of all, Sidney, we're not talking about blockading China or blockading Cuba. Big differences. The second thing is the question you don't raise is how does it play out if we don't do that? And how it plays out if we don't do that is we might as well start packing up and moving out of the Asia-Pacific area, because bit by bit by bit they continue this kind of aggressive activity. I mean, they're flying planes in front of our planes. We're having Japanese planes having to scramble 388 days out of the year, you know, or not 388 days, but 388 days total recently. And I mean, they're kind of frightening things, Sidney, because as those things continue to escalate, you really have the potential for more conflict, not less conflict. And if we don't have the freedom to sail those seas, we need to find it out now, not wait 7 years when the situation's a lot worse. Nobody's talking about a confrontation. We're talking about, do we have that right or not? If we do have that right, exercising that right. Let me tell you the other part of that. We should not always try to respond with the exact mirror image of what they're doing. So, for example, if they do something in cyber, it doesn't mean we have to respond in cyber. We can respond in other activities, but we need to have a response. The final thing is we invite them to RIMPAC. They show up with their spy ship, and we say, okay, to do that, what would you do if you were them next time? I'd have 2 spy ships there, And so, Sydney, I think, first of all, this is the time we need to decide what our position is as a nation. And then secondly, I don't think it's confrontational at all to say that we should have the right to those freedom of the seas, and it is freedom of the seas. It's not just freedom of navigation. And I think if we send those ships through there, I don't think we're going to have that confrontation. I think we're going to begin to slow down some of this aggression we're seeing take place. Is that it? Guys, I'm sorry, Alaska?
So given the cybersecurity agreement that was signed between China and the U.S., in which both parties agreed that there would be no state-sponsored cyber espionage for commercial gain, I would just like to get your thoughts on that agreement. Also, if you think the Chinese will abide by it, and if you think that this was a win for the U.S.
Every single agreement that comes out behind closed doors, I always ask, all right, explain to me how we won on this one, And so far, they haven't convinced me on too many of them. But this is not just under this administration, previous administration as well, when we were dealing with China. China really does have a different mindset than we do. They don't, we kind of think if you say one thing and do another thing, that's somehow bad culturally. We've grown up with that. China doesn't always feel that way. They feel, that's not always a bad thing to be able to do. I'll just say that, look at our nuclear treaties and how difficult it is to monitor those and what happens with those in cyber. Right now, the biggest challenge we have is attribution. Finding out who actually did it. So I'm all for us discussing that. I'm all for us having agreements. I don't think any of us go home and sleep a lot better tonight thinking that that's not going to happen. I think the way we have to do it is to prepare, and I'll close with this. There are a lot of differences between Republicans and Democrats, but there's a lot of similarities. And some of the best Democratic thinkers and Republican thinkers, when we have lunch together and talk, one of the things we realize is you never base your defense planning on someone's intent, because intent can change in 48 hours. You always base it on capacity and capability. And so what we have to constantly be looking at with the Chinese is what are they capable of doing with cyber. But it's not just the Chinese, it's across the globe. And that's what gives me more comfort than any agreement that anybody would sign. So with that, guys, thank y'all so much for all that you're doing. Thanks for having me.
Well, this isn't my house. It's Heritage's house, but on behalf of Heritage, our partner in this event, we'll bring the proceedings to a close. Thank you all again for coming, and keep an eye out for our publications on these topics. Thank you.